Hello and welcome to A-Team Group's Data Management Summit USA Virtual 2021. We'd like to thank our platinum sponsors, OneTrust Data Governance, Solidatus and Luxoft, and our gold sponsors, Alveo, Bureau van Dijk, Didactics, QSIP Global Services, the Derivatives Service Bureau, Smartstream, Big ID, ActiveNav, Kingland and TickSmith. You can connect with your peers on the networking page, and if you have questions for the speakers, please use the panel to the right of the video. Thank you for joining us today, and I hope you enjoy the summit. Hello and welcome to A-Team Group's Data Management Summit USA Virtual 2021. My name is Sarah Underwood and I'm an editor at A-Team Group and will host part of the summit today. The event will run over 2 days, today and tomorrow, with a live stream on each day that will explore how financial institutions are using data to drive a business and compliance insight. With the challenges of managing ever-increasing data volumes and types, including ESG data and mainstream adoption of cloud, AI and ML technologies, there are plenty of new approaches, capabilities and tools that we'll be talking about. Today, we've got some keynotes, fireside chats and panel discussions around some of these areas. And I would like very much to take the opportunity to thank our speakers and sponsors for their support, expertise and insight. Looking at the practicalities of the summit, you can visit the networking and sponsors section of the event to connect with sponsors and find out how they can help you. You can also see who else is attending and network with your peers and colleagues. And please do get involved by voting in the audience polls we'll be posting throughout the summit. You can also ask questions to our experts using the Slido panel to the right of your video. Okay, just one more thing to tell you about today, and we have some exciting news in the shape of a brand new channel on our A-Team Insight webinar. It's ESG Insight, and we'll be providing insight and commentary as the industry develops approaches and solutions to managing data, regulations and reporting for ESG. You can sign up at no cost, so make sure you take advantage of this free resource and keep following us. We'll be updating as we go along. And again, any feedback is always welcome. Also hot off the press, we have an ESG handbook that is available as a download from the A-Team Insight website. The 2021 edition of our popular Regulator Handbook, or Regulatory Data Handbook perhaps, is also coming out soon and will be available for you to download. Enough of me and on to the main event, kicking off with a 1 minute ad break from OneTrust. Okay, thank you very much indeed for that. And let's move on to our first session, which comprises a CDO data strategy conversation about leveraging data to drive business outcomes and digital transformation. I'm delighted to welcome Julia Bardmesser, Senior Vice President, Head of Data Management, Architecture and Salesforce Development at Voya, to lead the session. In her role, Julia is leading the transformation of Voya's enterprise assets in data, architecture, and Salesforce to increase agility and speed to market by eliminating redundant data silos and consolidating and automating data processes to deliver key insights from proprietary data and reduce the costs through reuse and infrastructure simplification. Julia is an award-winning data practitioner, having previously won Data Management Practitioner of the Year and A-Team Award, been recognized as a top 150 business transformation leader, and appeared in the top 100 Global Data Power Women in 2020 and 2021. So I'd like to welcome Paulette and David to join us. And then I can hand over to Julia if you're ready to take on this session. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. So welcome, everybody. I'm very excited to welcome my colleagues, Paulette and David, to this session. And the session is going to be on CDO data strategy, and we'll try to keep it as interactive as possible. I will ask Paulette and David to introduce themselves in a moment, but for right now, a couple of housekeeping notes. As I said, the best sessions that I have seen of this type, especially right now in the virtual world, are the ones that are most interactive and have a lot of audience participation. So to the right of your video, you will see a box for polls and for the questions. We will be running a poll in a moment, so please reply and share your experience with that. And as soon as you have questions, please ask them. This is not a long session. It's about 30 minutes, so don't wait till the end of the session to ask the questions. Please ask them as they occur to you. We, as you can imagine, have a list of questions that we're going to go through, but this is going to be a lot more interesting for everybody involved if you participate and put your questions, and we will interrupt our questions and we will address them as they come in. So with that, let's welcome David and Paulette. Please offer short introductions of yourselves. Paulette, if I can start with you.
Sure. Thanks, Julia. Thanks for having me today. My name is Paulette Dorozanski. I've recently joined Edward Jones as the head of master data and reference data. Prior to Edward Jones, I was at Brown Brothers for heading up data governance and also data capabilities for our data application and data fabric. And prior to that, I was at BNY Mellon with a variety of data strategy jobs for over 15 years. So it's really nice to be here today. Thank you.
David?
Great, thank you, and great to be here with both of you. And Paulette, you and I have something in common. I now work at BNY Mellon, so that's at the end of, or at least my current part of my career, whereas for you was at the, sounds like the onset or the beginning, earlier parts of your career. But anyway, have been part of the data world for a very long time, have grown up in lots of different financial services capacities, thinking about data from source to target and what that looks like. And has evolved with the evolution of data officers and data programs as we've gone from very disparate processes to trying to solve enterprise and global issues, problems, things, relative to data, and then leveraging data as an asset, which we're going to talk about, to a decent degree here in this morning's discussion. So looking forward to that. Currently, the Data and Analytics Chief Data Officer, and the Data and Analytics solution of BNY Mellon is a sub line of business that delivers data and analytics solutions to our customers across the organizations through platforms and data, with a huge drive to provide data as an asset, and have joined this organization relatively recently. So, loving the fact that I get to think about data in a different aspect than have done formerly in prior CDO roles or data officer roles, where it's been very reactive and defensive in nature, solving regulatory problems, et cetera. So looking forward to today's discussion.
Thank you, David. So this is the time for the poll question. And actually, David just gave an overview of his career. And I think the way we've structured this poll question is overview of many of our careers. So the poll question is, how is data viewed in your organization? And going from the bottom up, again, going back to early stages of my career when data was really not mentioned, it was only mentioned when the data load failed. And I remember a business person saying, you have a really hard job. Nobody cares about what you do unless it breaks. So that's the very first option. The data is not explicitly considered. Then as we have progressed, and about 11, 12 years ago with the financial crisis, our regulators started paying a lot of attention to data and said, well, it would help if you actually knew what your data was and where it's coming from, and would be nice if the data going into financial reporting and risk reporting and business reporting were actually the same when you knew how it related to each other. So that's the next view of data, like historically speaking, is fundamental capability that supports regulatory objectives. And then we have built a lot of capabilities while we were doing that, when we were satisfying regulatory requirements. And the next evolution was, okay, actually knowing where the data is, bringing it together, cleaning it up, having data quality helps with the operational efficiency. We can save some money if we do good data management. So that's our next option. The option after that is, okay, we have all of this data and we have tons of data internally and externally, and we understand where it is and we brought it together. We can actually support business strategy. Whatever our business, we can understand where our customers are, how to reach out to them, how our products are selling. There is a lot of fundamental support that data gives to our business objectives. And then the most advanced one at the moment, it's an asset that we can monetize. We can create a data-based product that we can sell and make money on that. So that's our poll question. Let's run the poll. And please respond to that poll. And while you're voting, I will ask my panel the first question. So going with data as an asset, and David, piggybacking from what you said, what really excites you about your job. So we've always said data as an asset. What does that mean? And can we actually monetize it? And what is the approach of monetizing data as an asset in the companies, that's their business, and that's what they do. But in companies like BNY Mellon or financial services company, how do you do that and how do you think about it? David, if you'd like to take that.
Yeah, Julia, thank you. And something you said when you were talking just a few minutes ago, and how that relates to what your question is that data is there to solve a business need. And I think sometimes we forget that organizations are solving, are providing business value. Underneath of that, there's data that's required to support and service that. And then to enable all of that, you have operational practices, you have technology infrastructure, everything you need to put in place to allow those pipelines and everything to be as optimal as possible to be able to drive those business solutions. And you also commented on how, over time, there's been a very reactive posture based on, regulatory push, as you just described, and looking at data across predominantly finance and risk, and how do we know we're speaking the same language? And now that things are being looked at an enterprise and curated at a much more high level, and you can see all the nuances of the data up underneath, how do we make sure that we understand what that looks like? But as we look at all of those options and opportunities there to solve that reactively, so we are using our data to the best of our ability, it opens the door for use cases, although maybe reactive in posture, that allow you to build sustainable frameworks that can catapult or accelerate you toward treating data as an asset, where you can get ahead of the curve and leverage the data that you're gathering across your organization and start turning it into something that's more meaningful or profitable. And that can mean a couple different things. You can look at the data in terms of how to course correct or manage your business strategy so that you can become more profitable in that sense, or you can turn the specific data attributes themselves into something that can be delivered to your clients, which is currently the role that I'm playing within a financial services organization. We are we like to think of ourselves as a mini fintech within a financial services group, trying to deliver data and platforms that enable that for our customers, and thinking through data pipelines and data optimization and supply chains in terms of being able to get that data in front of the client so that they can make the best business decision, but that becomes a commercializable asset for us to be able to deliver it in that mechanism. Last thing I'll say real quickly, because it ties into, it's also very role driven, right? So depending on what type of role you have is how much you can pivot between offensive posturing and defensive posturing. Some roles are very, very defensive in nature, and that's just your intent and purpose. But like I said before, the more we can leverage defensive use cases to drive scalable solutions that can accelerate us to monetization and optimization, that's where the key to the future is.
Thank you, David. Paulette, do you have, would you like to add something? Like, what's your experience with data as an asset and getting all the way to thinking about how to monetize it?
Right. Yeah. So I think David hit on a lot of very good points on that. Right. And I would just like to add to it. I think he said, building sustainable frameworks, right? And with the data, as you build out a lot of companies are building out very large data fabrics or, data platforms, and they have to, think about how are they making that available to their own business, and at that same time, how do they create it that they're flexible enough to take in client data or other data, vendor data, what's the entitlements of that, and be able to, put that out and publish that out back to the business and to clients as they go as well, right? So, I would just like to kind of that's where I usually come in, is that how do we look at that, and how do we take that in, and how do we look at it's, we've been looking at it for our business for so long. Now let's look at it for, whoever wants it, right? And develop those frameworks for everybody. So
thank you, Paulette. And we now have, I think we have responses to the poll, and I voted too. So in that, I don't know, David and Paulette, if you managed to vote while you were answering the question. And this is actually, this is pretty much what I would have expected. So it's nice to know that not explicitly considered is no longer an option. Isn't that, I still remember that conversation 15 years ago where basically I was told, don't talk to me unless there is a problem. So it's good that we're past those age, but I also seen that the asset to be monetized is not as present, but fundamental capability that supports key strategic business growth, that's up there. And that's good to see. So we're pivoting much more from defensive regulatory, even though, it still needs to support regulatory objectives, right? That's not going away. But there is a lot more pivot and a lot more conversation. And I've noticed that in the last 3 to 4 years in my own career, that majority of the conversations I'm having is around support of the business growth on this. So we also have a first question, which is actually, interestingly enough, very similar to the next question that I was going to ask. And so the question is around what is the critical success factor when you're thinking about data strategy for firms? So, and I'm going to add a little bit, what is the critical success factor and what are the challenges? So we've been trying to do this for a while, all of us. What were the challenges that we have experienced, and what you believe is a critical success factor in advancing a business strategy with the data, using the data capabilities, and with the partnering with the business? Paulette, if I can go to you with that question.
Yeah, that's a good question, right? So, I think trying to, get the data together for the business, and really working with the business to sort of understand what that data is, right? And working with them to, think about, what do they really want, and how do they want to, publish this out, and how do they want to really maybe, work with clients or internally to be able to, I guess, create that agenda. And then what we've always done is, help them build that agenda. And that's always been working with them to prioritize that and work through that with them. I'll say though as well, right, that strategy, I think a lot of people are kind of going down that different strategy and just trying to, figure out what that is today. A lot of people have been, delivering data for years, and now there's a different opportunity to across different platforms to share that data in different ways. And, that's our job to kind of think about how do we monetize that, or how do we incorporate that into our data strategy as well, right? I think the technology has opened up that it's so much easier now.
Yeah, so. I agree. David, would you share any challenges that you've had?
Yeah, thank you. And before answering that specifically, I'm responding to the polling responses as well, because the number one item on there was leveraging data to advance business strategy, which ties exactly into this question. And, there's also there was the other option as a response, monetizing data as an asset. And there is some overlap in interpretation between those two, tactical responses. And what I said earlier prior to the polling is that driving business strategy and creating growth for your organization is an inherent way of driving forward on treating data as an asset and moving forward on your data strategy and thinking it from that aspect. It's not always equal to just being able to sell the data in its its most tangible format for whatever reason and purpose, but how do you deliver and derive insights off of that? So then also going back to what I was saying earlier about building on defensive posture, or using your defensive posture to build scalable models, as you as an organization or a data leader are thinking about how data is leveraged across your organization. And there's lots of ways to drive that. Over time, we've heard about data stores, data lakes, now more virtualization of data. How do we move forward on all of that to make the data as accessible as possible? Doesn't mean that you have to persist all of the data in a single location. It means making the data accessible, making it leverageable so that you can look across the data to drive or derive those business solutions. And it's also about getting ahead of the curve, right? Because a lot of time in that defensive posturing, we spend a significant number of resource hours just on trying to keep up with regulatory demand or external pressures. And when you can start getting ahead of what those regulatory pressures are, then you can start positioning yourself before those questions come in. You're already positioning yourself, providing a solid data strategy. Then you can also start getting ahead. And I also think it's fair to say anywhere where you're thinking ahead of the curve or solving a business need in advance of someone else telling you to do it, that is an offensive posture. Maybe not fully on the spectrum toward treating data as a monetized asset, but it is directionally the way to go, and definitely a checkpoint on the success criteria for moving forward.
I would agree. So if I were to summarize, basically to answer the question that we have, it's critical success factor is thinking ahead of the demand and thinking ahead based on what we have done from a regulatory perspective, how to position it for the business value. So one of the ways we use data, and that's one of the ways that it brings the value, is analytics. So analytics obviously rely on a lot of data. And historically, one of the things I've seen that in the last few years, that analytics team, data science team been put in place before data management teams. And then the realization came that it's kind of difficult to do really good data science analytics modeling if you don't have good data. Well, for a multitude of reasons. One of them is that your data scientists spend a lot of time figuring out where the data is, and then you don't have enough confidence in the quality of this data and appropriateness of this data to be confident in the outcome of your predictive modeling. So if I can ask David, start with you on where do you see new opportunities in terms of the data analytics efforts?
I agree with what you said in the terms of, and now that we are, moving faster and faster toward the ability to access our data, opening up those channels for leveraging and driving data analytics, data science. But I also go back to, I've seen several initiatives take place around data science where it's not clear and understood what business need or challenge or problem you're really looking to solve. And you can get lost in the data. It's very easy to get lost in the forest or lost in the trees and not be able to see the forest. And so having that clear perspective on what you want not what you expect the outcome to be, but what question you want to answer, and being relatively prescriptive or scoped on what that looks like. And you'll learn and you'll grow from those responses and how that all plays together. So that's one avenue when we think about how do we leverage the data, how do we drive toward analytics, how do we drive toward science, and make sure that we're not trying to boil the ocean and that we're looking for solid business goals to help solve for. And the other thing, and I think this is inherent in probably the most natural way, is just the ability to profile and see through dashboards and other analytical capabilities what we're doing as an organization. What are our trends? What are our practices? And how can that, through analytics and forward-looking, help us change our business in strategy. So again, that culmination or curation of data, it definitely provides a lot more capabilities around that to drive those type of analytics.
Thank you, David. We actually got a follow-up on the question before, and I'm going to address it, David, to you. Can you give an example of how you leveraged your defensive strategy for offense?
Absolutely. So in my prior organization, I was the Chief Data Officer for North America for Commerce Bank, and a huge focus of mine was working with my financial crimes partners to put in the right pipelines, data pipelines, to make sure that we were handling as robustly and forward-thinking as we could all of our regulatory requirements for managing financial crimes. That same transactional and customer data that's required to be able to solve financial crimes is also the same data that you're using for a magnitude of other things. And financial crimes requires you to marry transactional data to customer data, and even bring it up at the product set level based on what your organization is trying to deliver as a product set. So inherently, you have the opportunity to figure out how your data strategy can put that data or access that data in such a manner that you can now leverage it for other business solutions and other business needs, where that same data set can become of value. So looking in, and it might have been Paulette earlier talked about, your partners, and I think about your stakeholders. If you know what your stakeholder needs are, then how can you translate that and identify the marketable value of the data that you're already curating for, in this case, the financial crimes requirements, so that you can help, I don't want to say market, but at least share the opportunities with your other key stakeholders on how that same data could be leveraged to solve other business needs.
Thank you, David. Paulette, if I can ask you, so can you give some examples as well how you're positioning the data function as a value-added service, including the embedded data capabilities such as data quality, business integration, architecture, data analytics as a service? Just what are your experiences and examples, any of those, not all of them, any of those? What do you find most useful of data capabilities that embed into the business and drive business value?
So we had in a previous role had really taken a look at, building out a data fabric and really thinking about how would we be able to utilize this fabric and this data platform and be able to take in other data from other financial institutions or other clients, and sort of how could we build that, and how can we sort of sound that back to clients as well, right? Like, how can we process their data for them? How can we, run analytics for them? But, the same analytics, everything we sort of looked at was, how can we do this and sort of sound that back to somebody else, right? And it started for me in some ways, right, looking at the catalog and looking at our data quality function and understanding, like, just putting, simple metrics out there for data quality and things like that. But then, and my focus was, that piece of it, as well as sort of the, the access to the data, sort of the entitlements of the data as well. So that's kind of how I always approach it, is that, how can I build this? And again, I sort of said this before, right? Like, flexibly, that we could make this a product or a service and turn this back out, right? Like, everything goes with that sort of product mindset, and how do I change that around, right? So come to me with your business problem. If it's your business problem, it's probably other people's business problem as well, right? How do we take that and how do we evolve that?
Yeah, Paulette, I agree. Actually, that's one of the approaches I have used as well. And the way I call it, and I explained it to the business, we built for a specific business use case. but the way we build is applicable to multiple. So it needs to be reusable. That's actually where the value of enterprise data team comes in, because instead of building in silos, the way we build is reusable. And in 3 years that I've been in Voya, we've been able to do it multiple times. We have built multiple capabilities for very specific business, solving a very specific business problem, but then we have reused it across multiple business lines for multiple other business solutions or business support that require the same capability or the same set of data. And sometimes it's both, and then that's when you hit a lottery, you win the lottery, because when you can reuse both the data and the capability, then it's a very easy time to market. It's a really clear benefit to the organization to be able to do that. So to move on, of course, we're now 18 months doing this virtually, right? We are working, most of us are working virtually, as I think many people have heard me say now many times over the past 18 months. I'm been tired of it for the last 12 months. Of the 18 months, I really want to do this in person. But there have been also some positive changes as well of being basically digital presence. Right now, we're digital presences, right? And digital and data does go together. And I think there's been some acceleration that I have seen as well. So for the past 18 months, what's been your experience? And have you seen this whole situation, COVID, recovery, being remote, working remotely, delivering a lot of documents in a digital format as opposed to paper? Have you seen that being as a catalyst for the data strategies? And David, if I can go to you with that.
Thank you, Julia. And it looks like there's a question that's very relevant to the question you're asking here. So I'm going to marry them together, if that's okay. The question is, how do you see data strategy evolving over the next year? So thinking about your question, how our lifestyles in the last 18 months have catapulted us in many good ways forward. And then how are we leveraging that over the next year plus as opportunities and growth or opportunities for acceleration and growth around that. And I agree with you that the last 18 months have been an enormous opportunity for cultural shift in terms of people understanding the value of digital, the value of thinking about things differently, because we were forced to jump into that with both feet and figure it out. And I can say across the organizations that I've been a part of, the mindset to understand the value of, not that traditional mindset. Everybody has to be doing things the same way. How do we bring information together in a way that is digital and can be accessible by people in many locations? What does that look like? Again, are opportunistic in terms of, everything we've been talking about here, using data to help evolve business strategy and to use data as an asset, because it created those opportunities, even if it's way down at the foundational level, to start thinking about how that's differently. And then specifically to data strategy over the next year plus, data strategy and data roles are changing as rapidly as the weather. And so, we need to continue to be aware of our surroundings and the evolving architectures and the evolving opportunities so that we are solving those business needs that are happening. I don't think, though, that the foundation of what we need to do to make data accessible is changing. How we do that, the architecture around that is what's evolving. And we need to be able to stay nimble and agile along those terms to be able to continue our trajectories forward to solve those business solutions. And I think it's key and fundamental for officers like ourselves to be very aware of our surroundings, to broker the producers of data to the consumers of data. So we're constantly evaluating for business need and business opportunity. It's not just about the curation of the data, but it's also about the identification of opportunity and how we can then insert opportunity into business value and drive data strategy respective to that.
Thank you, David. And then Paulette, we have about 1 minute left. So how do you see, given the experience of the last 18 months and experience of our, the last 10 plus years, how do you see data strategy evolving in the next year and a half to 2 years?
Yeah, I really think it sort of continues down this trajectory of like product and service, right? That we will just capitalize on how we can make data available And now it's not just integrate in our own company, but it's integrate, throughout these other institutions, right? And it's just, can we charge for it or not, right? And that's what it comes down to. And so it's, making sure that we can cross, right? It's not just creating a catalog or something for my organization, but it's industry wide and really realizing that. Thanks.
Thank you, David and Paulette. Wonderful discussion, and I thank you, audience, for participating in it and asking us questions. And I look forward to seeing you all in real life.
Thanks, Julia.
Thank you.
Thank you indeed. And thank you, Julia, David and Paulette, for opening today's summit and for a great conversation to get us going today. If you're interested in hearing more about some of the topics we've just discussed, make sure you register for 18 Group's upcoming webinar on the 12th of October, Optimizing Analytics, the Role of Data Quality and Data Governance. So let's move on to our first panel session of the day. John Batega, President of the EDM Council, is going to moderate a 45-minute discussion among our expert speakers on best practice data management for successful and sustainable cloud deployment. John is a senior data management strategist and executive with over 40 years of experience in the finance industry. He was one of the first chief data officers in finance with his appointment as CDO at Citibank, and went on to hold the role of CDO in both public and private sector organizations, serving as CDO for Bank of America and holding the post of CDO for the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Today, John is the president of the EDM Council, a non-profit professional trade association focused on elevating the practice of data management through best practices, data standards, research, and education. So over to you, John, and your panelists, and all yours.
Very good, Sarah. Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. A couple of things up front. We're going to be doing some slide-out questions and also questions throughout the event. But let me start by kind of introducing the panel or the topic of the panel. And I'd say by now everybody would agree that one of the consequential impacts of the global pandemic, at least from an information management perspective, has been this drive towards digitization. In fact, the other day, I actually heard somebody refer to this pandemic digitization phenomenon as the COVID accelerator. So we're adding words to our language. The global pandemic has disrupted everything in our lives, right? On a personal basis, impacting our families and friends and loved ones, and there's no denying that. On a professional basis, the pandemic has changed the way we do business, the way we socialize, the way we exercise, the way we shop for clothes, even when we order food. Everything seems to be taking place online. And with this digital transformation comes a huge increase in our digital footprint all over the internet. What we do, what we look at, what we like or dislike is all in the cloud. Now, most analysts predict that by 2025, nearly half, 50% of all data stored will be in the cloud. Given this reality, how should firms be looking at their cloud environments when it comes to striking that balance of innovative access and use while maintaining privacy, security, and having a handle on appropriate, responsible, and ethical use of this data? How do we strive to achieve these objectives while balancing risks? How do we impose controls without impeding progress? How do we increase analysis without infringing on privacy? And how do we embrace and exploit the benefits of cloud technology without losing control of our data? And to join me this morning, or this afternoon, please allow me to introduce our panelists. From Societe Generale, Doris Brophy, Managing Director, Data Governance and Standards. From KPMG, Rob Wentz, Managing Director. From Kingland, Matt Good, Chief Technology Evangelist. And from Alveo, Nathan Wollivier, Managing Director, Americas. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you.
Everybody's mics are on. Rob, if you would unmute yourself.
Morning.
You don't want to miss any good comments you make during. Let me start with just a little legal disclaimer. The opinions expressed here today are the opinions of the panelists and not the opinions of their organizations where they are employed. Okay, with that out of the way. Let me remind the audience on how to get involved. To the right of the video box, you'll see a box for questions and polls. And we'll be running a couple of polls, so please vote and help us gauge industry opinion. If you'd like to ask questions of our panelists, we'll take these questions from the audience throughout the discussion, and I'll try to filter them in throughout discussion. So please feel free to add your questions to the box under the question tab. So we're going to open with a poll question, and I invite you to cast your vote. So on your Slido screen, poll question 1, considering your journey to cloud adoption, what is the level of maturity in your organization? And the answers are: we are experimenting with cloud, have a few POCs. We're developing our cloud capabilities and have a defined strategy. We're becoming mature with hybrid and multi-cloud environments, adopting AI and ML and data science cloud services. We are a mature environment with advanced automation. And the last option is we are cloud mandated and optimizing across the organization. So I'm going to give everybody some time to respond to that. We'll track those answers. While you're doing that, I'm going to jump into the first question. So for my first question, I want to ask what probably seems like a really obvious question until you dig under the surface. But here goes. Why cloud? What's so attractive about this platform? Now, for those of you who've been around a while, we actually had this concept of cloud 40 years ago. It was called data time sharing, having your data in a third-party platform. In fact, the airline industry was one of the biggest catalysts of data time sharing back in the day. So what's different now? What are the business drivers behind cloud? What are firms trying to achieve via migration to the cloud? And what is it that that will enable that you could do in the cloud that you couldn't do on-prem, or at least do on-prem easily? So Nathan, I'm going to start with you, and then I'm going to ask the other panelists to jump in.
So, I mean, that's a good question, right? That is the question. And I would say probably the primary driver is that it's good business. So, you know, I think, you know, as we're doing this on a Zoom call, you know, usually we'd be on a panel discussion sitting all together, although I like that Matt has somehow made a virtual panel. So kudos to Matt for embracing the entire spirit of this. But it fits this pandemic and the industry state to like a glove, I would say. You know, we constantly are talking with clients that are saying, you know, we are dealing with a distributed workforce, distributed operations. We need to be building resilient and redundant services and applications. Oh, and by the way, nobody's giving us large budgets to go do this. And so I think moving to the cloud is sort of one of those easy answers, or at least one of those things to look at for most firms. I would also say that I would you know, maybe frame this, because I think we're going to have a couple of different points of view on this, and that there's probably, you know, and you know, you've done some stuff, I think, with the EDM Council, with the CDMC, John, but a difference between, I think, moving effectively your data into the cloud, or moving your applications or your infrastructure into the cloud and going to a full sort of cloud footprint, and moving selective data management capabilities into the cloud to more of a data as a service, or data or an infrastructure supporting, or a cloud supporting a data management infrastructure. And so I think that there's pros and cons of doing both of those, but one of the things to think about is that moving your application stack into the cloud doesn't necessarily get you all of the benefits of being in the cloud. You need to actually have native cloud applications, connectivity, security apparatus, and everything else in order to make that more efficient. And that actually what clients are talking to us about is not just the technical aspects of moving into the cloud, but the operational aspects of that. And really thinking about a total transformational effort of moving data management, not just as a method of, you know, getting compute power, renting compute power, but how can I have a distributed operation, both technically and operationally?
Actually, Nathan, and thanks for bringing up the CDMC, and that's about data management in the cloud. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. Let me just jump to Rob for a second. Rob, as you work with your clients, is cloud a cost play, or is it a capability play? What are you seeing?
I think it's a little bit of everything. I would suggest that a lot of organizations are still arriving, that they're still figuring out how to do it, right? What I also see is there's opportunity out there that what they're looking to do is get out of the complex environments that they're in. And when I say that, I'll just use a simple example. You look at some of the large applications, the ERPs, the HR systems, the complexities that they have in their current environments, they're looking to streamline that. So when you migrate to a cloud-based Oracle instance or a cloud-based Workday instance, you can't make the changes and the customizations that you have made in the past. You've got to migrate to a model. So part of it is to simplify the model, and a lot of the approaches that our teams that are doing those package migrations or those implementations, it becomes a configuration issue. They're no longer able to write these custom things where they jump out and do something custom and shove it, attach it to their existing ERP system. When you migrate to the cloud, you have a version of that application, and that's what you get. You can't make a lot of those modifications. So in a lot of cases, from our perspective, it's the streamlining of those processes, making them less complex. Tell us why not this, why won't this standard process work for somebody? So I think that's another component to it as well, is sometimes it gives a firm the opportunity to streamline and get out of the mire that they've created for themselves in the old world.
Yeah. Doris, if you can give us the generic answer, we won't be specific to your bank, but you work with a lot of colleagues in different banks throughout the industry. What are you hearing, or what are you seeing is the drive towards cloud from a financial industry perspective?
Yeah. So the first question was why, and Nathan answered that right off the get-go with business reasons, right? So it really always needs to come down to making business sense. And moving to the cloud doesn't always make business sense, actually. You need to look at your cases individually and determine, is this a good business case for moving to the cloud? So why? What makes a good business case for moving to the cloud? It would be things like, well, when you size your on-prem data center, you're maxing it out, right, for your biggest capacity that you'll ever need. When you move to the public cloud, then it's flexible, right? Like you incur the costs as you use them. So when you're heavy, you have, the expansion, and that allows you to meet your needs. But when you're not always operating at that extent, then it comes in and you have less costs, right? So it allows this flexibility, which actually improves your cost and expenditures, right? And then there's the old school that you mentioned before, right? That used to happen, like the sharing, right? The economies of scale where you get expertise. And in the finance industry, ideally, we would keep our expertise focused on things that give us a competitive edge in the financial industry. And typically, data center management, security, and things like that might not give us the banking competitive edge, right? The investment banking competitive edge. There's other things that people talk about, like, right, everything's about ESG today. So there may be the environmental impacts of moving into that shared environment might be better for the environment overall. Those are reasons some banks move as well. When Rob was talking, he was taking like a little bit of a different slant on it than I was thinking about. Like I was thinking about why a bank might move their things, right? Their data, their compute into the public cloud. But Rob was talking about the service provider's public cloud, right? Where now I'm not having my customized environment anymore. I'm getting into that service provider's environment. And from a banking point of view, that's a very different question, right? So when we look at security and regulation and all of that, we have to look at that as a different why.
So I've heard cost play, capability play, you mentioned security play. So all of those, I think you're right, are all filtered in there. Matt, by the way, I loved your title as the evangelist. So let me ask you, are you evangelizing cloud with your clients?
Yeah, you bet. Hey, and just a quick mic check. Do I sound okay? Everything's coming through okay?
Perfect.
Okay, excellent.
We've got good morning.
We certainly do.
Sitting back and, you know.
We try, you bet. I think all of the points have already really been covered. There's a couple of just deeper dive items. I think we'll get to it through some of the rest of the questions of the panel as well. But In some aspects, there's a cloud optimization that was already mentioned by both Nathan and Rob that, we often see with our clients, and certainly what we invest in our platform, it can't necessarily be what's commonly termed as a lift and shift. You have to kind of chip away at that opportunity to really take advantage of the capabilities that the major cloud vendors are providing from architectural blueprints and such. From a business drivers and benefits perspective, of course, critical data management capabilities, critical regulatory reporting and compliance management capabilities. As you start to unpack those a little bit, you realize that they may enforce a secure need to access data in an aggregated way to deliver on those capabilities. Cloud capabilities offer that, of course, there's benefits there. We've also seen with our clients that there's heavy residency requirements. So we've worked with clients recently where we move actually compute, storage, network instances and our capabilities of our platform from the US over to Europe because of client demands, global client requirements, usage requirements. The cloud for us and our investment there really makes that possible. And then maybe one final thing I'll just mention so we can keep moving on is that this and I think Doris was mentioning it as well, just from a sizing perspective, the ability to scale based on data access, based on data usage needs, just based on users, concurrent users and such. I know that we've worked with our clients on that. We invest in our capabilities such that we can scale up and down based on demand. Actually, we'll probably talk about it later. The scale down is the hard part. It's usually easy with the cloud providers to scale up and say, hey, we're going to spend more money supporting the data access and the usage, but we can't forget to scale back down as well when the usage is less. So security investments by the vendors, scalability capabilities, residency, that's at one layer deeper when we start to satisfy the business need of critical data management capabilities and regulatory reporting and such that allows us to satisfy those business needs through cloud usage.
A really good point about scale down. One of the features of the framework that we're going to talk about, the CDMC, is the exit strategy and how to manage both sides of that coin, right? So I think we're going to touch upon that. Okay, let me bring up the results of the Slido. Oh, there they are. So if our panel can take a look at that and opine on that. The key answer seems to be we are developing our cloud capabilities and have a defined strategy. That's the winning answer. So no one is mature, not surprising. We are cloud mandated and optimized. No one is really in that space, only 4%. It's encouraging to see that more people have a defined strategy than they do at just experimenting. And then, of course, the last answer, we're becoming mature, that's growing a bit. So opinions from our panel, what do you think of those results?
Hey, I could just jump in here real quick because I see the second one. I agree with, this is sort of what we see from our own context and industry. I think the second one is kind of interesting because it changes a little bit of what we've done in the past and maybe some of is sort of this business user enablement concept that we are seeing a lot. And the notion that now cloud allows you to spin up and offer services at a much more tactical level than you could in the past. So what we have seen is from a couple of firms and working with some of our cloud partners is firms that have taken initiatives in the AI ML space and realized that by using these types of highly automated processes and having bad data is a recipe for disaster. So it's almost now that we're seeing a second wave initiative where it used to be like, this was all about securities, transaction processing and settlement and risk. Now we're seeing this where front office applications, as things get more automated, they need access to high quality data and can't wait for this to be done through traditional data services organizations internally and are coming to providers like Alveo. So that would be just my initial response to that.
Thanks. Yeah.
For me, it kind of makes sense because it's kind of like the order of progression of the way you do things, right? So many people come up with their cloud strategy. And then, like we were talking before, you need your good business case, right? And not everything is a business case for cloud strategy. So then you realize, oh, I need a hybrid strategy, actually. So it makes sense that like the hybrid and the AI are kind of bundled, but we're not there yet, right? Like if you have low latency requirements and you need to co-locate something, like you're not going for your public cloud setup. So I think it's a natural progression.
Oh. All right, so let me move on. So we've all heard now the great opportunities in cloud, but with every new innovation, there's always going to be some risks and challenges, right? So I'm going to ask this question of the panel, and then I'm going to ask another Slido question of the audience. As the expression goes, if it was easy, everybody have it done, right? It's not so easy. So with that said, what are some of the obvious challenges, and what are some of the not so obvious challenges that, if we fully understand it, can, or if we don't understand it, can increase the risks in cloud? Now, let me bring up the next Slido question because it's on the same topic. What is your number one risk or challenge around working in the cloud? Is it regulatory? Is it governance control? Is it based on data security? An issue of resources, as we just kind of alluded to, or managing the data in a multi-cloud or hybrid cloud environment? So while the audience responds to that, and please, respond to the Slido questions, I'm going to turn it back over to the panel. Why don't we start with Matt? What do you see as maybe the obvious and not so obvious challenges?
Yeah, I might point on three things in particular. One of them is really not an obvious one, so we'll hit that last. The first two we touched on already a little bit with a benefit is also a challenge, so security and scalability. So from the security perspective, again, the major cloud vendors are investing billions of dollars in security capabilities, and there's always more to go. I know that what we found in working with our clients in our cloud journey as well is that while it makes it easier, as an example, to just check a checkbox and say encryption is on, ready to rock with it, we have to make sure that we do that. No different than if we've got 5 or 6 locks on the front door of our house and we got an excellent security system, we still have to make sure it's actually on. So I think, the capabilities of the cloud data management capabilities and that framework from Medium Council are going to help with this. It provides a framework for how we can audit this. There's obviously annual audits and such certifications that organizations go through. But that's one of those things we got to make sure that things are on, that we're doing things correctly, and usually we enforce that through framework and audit. Scalability, I did touch on a little bit. Usually scaling up is easier. Scaling down is a little bit more difficult. We have had to engineer capabilities into our platform to be able to support that appropriately for our clients. And then the third one, and then I'll pass it on to the panel, the not so obvious one is what I'd call like the kid in the candy store syndrome. So from an engineering, from a data practitioner perspective, all of a sudden you have all of these tools and services and capabilities at your fingerprint or at your thumbs ready to rock. And it's like, oh my gosh, you have all this capability you can use, but it still has to solve a business benefit. We can't just engineer for engineering's sake. We can build great infrastructure, but it still has to solve a business problem. So we've seen a little bit of that, in our cloud journey over the last 7 years, that we get enamored with the capabilities. And the next thing you know, it's like, maybe that data lake I don't even need, and this is what I need instead. So that's one of the not so obvious things. And before passing on, I'd say if anyone wants to Google moving to the cloud is like raising a teenager, our chief technology officer, Jason Toyne, authored a blog piece around this. And he kind of digs into some of the technical aspects of it, but it's pretty funny.
That's great. Doris, you and I grew up in the technology world. We love our toys, don't we? Right? So, it is. That's a great point, Matt. Something that we should explore more. Doris, I'm going to go back to you again. Obviously, finance is a highly regulated industry. What are the risks there? And when I mentioned that the benefits to all the different verticals, there are benefits to the regulatory community as well. But that also then infers, regulators will ask certain capabilities of regulated organizations. What do you see in that space?
So it is twofold. And I'm glad you asked me this because this is what I was thinking about when I was listening to Matt answer the question. He was saying, oh, these are the hard parts. And I was thinking, oh, no, I think those are the easy parts, actually. So like the fact that we can get the CDMC together with all these experts, right? And just amazing number of participants and the brain power that went into that. And it really clearly defines like these best practices, kind of like your Bible on how to do, public cloud, right? Well, for me, what's the hard part? The regulators haven't made up their minds yet, and they're not consistent from region to region yet. So, John, you were kind of mentioning the positive side, like we can meet regulatory expectations easier, maybe with our reporting and maybe not giving reports anymore, but giving data, right? So that's like the future progression. But there's also the difficult side of the regulators is like we're a global organization. Many organizations are global organizations. You can't meet those global regulatory expectations. They're not even well defined yet. So it is really hard to figure out what's okay and what's not okay globally as far as data in the public cloud, usage of the public cloud. It's very challenging.
Rob, you see obviously a lot of work in the cloud space, and I'm going to hit you up in a bit to tell us about the CDMC. But in your journey with customers, it's not a simple singular solution anymore, right? They've got multi-cloud providers all over the place, and
Yeah, and I think I agree with what a lot of the things Matt had said, that it introduces a lot of challenges. And I jotted down a couple things. Number one is trust. Trust is a big thing. And this, Doris pointed out, obviously, I'm thinking about people start putting things out there in those public clouds and they're relying on those third-party vendors. One of the things that we see is, and this really goes back to the basis of the data, when you put stuff out there, you still are responsible for it. So it's still yours to own versus I can depend 100% that vendor is going to do something for me, right? So you have to protect yourself. So it introduces a different level of risk because it's almost out of sight, out of mind, and I don't have to deal with it, but I still have that responsibility. So, and you can look at it, Doris mentioned the regulations, GDPR, when you have information in the cloud, it's your responsibility to make sure it's being adhered to. With the storage and the processing capabilities. Now, sure, the third-party vendor is going to do it for you, but it's not their responsibility, it's still yours. So you have to realize that just because I detached it or I put it out there, it's still my responsibility. So that's one thing. The other thing is the complexity, and Matt talked a little bit about these, and I jotted down, so skills, new skill sets. So Matt's comment of we have to make sure we flip the switch, that's a whole skill set that you have to understand how to manage and organize these environments. It's a different architecture, it's a different set of tools. So you have to have that capability. So introducing all those new technologies requires a new skill set. It requires a different definition or a different paying attention to it. It's an understanding. It's a different understanding that you have to deal with. So it increases that complexity that you've introduced into your environment. Now, the other thing, I'll give a little bit of a throwback, and Matt talked about this. Let's just not engineer for the sake of engineering. Not that long ago, we all talked about big data, right? That was the buzzwords, going back a short period of time, what I would describe. I don't know how many clients I had that came to us or to me and said, hey, can you take a look at my environment and tell me if it's any good? So they create these big data environments. And my first question in doing a project, they're trying to help somebody with that is, well, why did you do it? And I go back to Doris, what's the purpose that you're even stepping into this? And the answer was, well, we did it because we had to. And in one particular case, I found out that the CEO or the CIO had been at a board meeting and somebody in one of the groups, external, had asked, hey, what are you doing about big data? And he didn't have an answer. So he stood up a big data instance and said, hey, come tell me if this is any good so that when I go to the next board meeting, I give him an answer that we did something with it. This is very similar. Don't over-engineer it. And then this is where I go back to the word strategy. You have to have a strategy for it. It's got to be connected to the business. It's got to be connected to the business requirements. And there's got to be a reason why we're going to do it. But then make sure that strategy has all the layers included. Business architecture, the data architecture, the technology architecture, they all have to work collectively together off of that set of business drivers. So I'll stop there, but I agree 100% with what Matt and everybody else is saying. Have a strategy and a reason to do it. Don't do it just to do it.
I wonder that
the big data comment you made just reminds me of a call I got back then. Someone called and says, we want to do big data. And I said, well, what's your driver? Well, I read an article on it.
Exactly.
That was
Exactly.
The previous poll. I wonder the previous poll, there could be excellent why reasons behind it, but I think AI/ML was too, right? That's very much the same. What are you doing with AI/ML? I don't know. Let's do something.
Exactly.
Exactly. Rob, I'm going to circle back to you because I do want to talk about the CDMC, but let me go to Nathan just to get your opinion, Nathan, on the challenges and what are you seeing in your space?
Well, I mean, I think Rob just nailed it, right? Big data. I mean, I think the current name is Big Mess. But it is, one of these projects, with no, huge ambitions about we'll put all of our data as an asset. We're going to put it in an area. We're not going to go ahead and have a data catalog or taxonomy or anything else. We're just going to dump it someplace and hope for the best. And this also follows on to an earlier point, which I think we were talking about. What are the big challenges? And part of this is, and John, you and I have talked about this way back when you were at Citi, like, sometimes these problems just don't change that much, or they're not about it's the basic analysis and understanding of where your data is, who's using it, what's the purpose, this is not, this is just sort of things that you should probably be doing as best practices in your organization just to get an understanding of that. I think what cloud allows you to do, and what we kind of talk about with our clients, is you probably are going to end up with some hybrid type of model. You need to focus on the things of which you, through regulation or internal controls, have got to focus on and keep captive and make sure. But the other stuff, and I think Doris mentioned, the non-differentiating things, the things that don't give you a competitive advantage, which are cost centers, which you can offload and partner with firms like Alveo, who can do this more effectively for you for the things that you don't want to do anyway, and then feed your larger cloud strategy, that enterprise data fabric, which, KPMG, Kingland, some of these bigger firms that have some advisory practice can help you out in sort of making that strategy come together. But you also want to go, I think, and look at particular areas of expertise in which firms in more of a data as a service type strategy can help you lower your costs. And I think actually Rob said this, move the risk from the firm to the vendor. That's a huge value proposition these days. Is vendors like Alveo have to step up and take more risk on sort of a service-oriented delivery mechanism and make sure that we now are taking that risk off from clients. And that, I think, is also a huge benefit.
Before we get into what the industry is doing, I do want to share the poll results on the challenges. If we could take a look at those real quick. So managing data in multi-cloud and hybrid cloud. There you go, Rob, what we just talked about. That seems to be one of the biggest challenges. My opinion, and then the reality of that is, now you've got capabilities that have to exist across multi-applications plus on-prem. So that does create some challenges. What are your opinions, of all the panelists?
I think that for me, and it could be because, as you said when you introduced me, my role is governance. I'm surprised to see that governance isn't higher, because it is a real struggle. And, Matt mentioned AI and Nathan said the model word, and the governance of the data usage by AI, by tools or models, however we end up classifying them, is going to continue to grow and challenge and in regulatory oversight. So
one of the questions from the audience on risks is there an inherent risk in outages? I think we've seen improvement in that space. I know when I was with the government, regulators got one touch cloud, but now there's a level of trust that certain things can be moved. Do you see that as a risk in moving to cloud?
I'd say from our experience, we've seen it mature significantly. I think, in the top three players being Amazon, Google, and Microsoft, they have their stats for their uptime and such. It has matured significantly. And it is one of those things where if there is a significant outage, there are a lot of people and companies out, right? Because they have significant regional presences across the world. So again, we feel it's an acceptable risk because the investment to have that infrastructure and capability internally or on-prem is very, very difficult. So I think the comment was we move the risk actually in that area to the cloud vendor. We move the risk to them.
So an
Your
outage
business
of cloud
content-
vendor, an outage at cloud vendor means the unemployment rate goes up because people lose their jobs.
Everybody's out.
Everybody's out. Yeah.
I would say in response to that, it's probably the risk out in the cloud, in the public cloud, is probably not much different than the risk that you're taking right now internally. Mm-hmm. So even if you have the on-prem, you still have that risk of outage and you still need that redundancy capability. I would say they're out in that cloud environment. They're probably able to achieve a common model so that the risk is probably not as significant.
Yeah, I would also just echo that and just say, I'd be interested to hear, Doris maybe knows, but most of these guys are offering 4 nines of reliability and uptime. So, and this is actually something that they guarantee. I'd love to hear at which firm the IT department is guaranteeing 4 nines of uptime and putting their jobs on the line in that level of service. I just don't. It is one of those things where you have to let your teenager, I guess, walk out the door and go to college, but hopefully they're well prepared and the risks are mitigated. But this is one of those things where I think most of these vendors, this is their job, is to build in resiliency and redundancy and everything else. So 4 nines is pretty standard.
So a good segue to the last part of our panel is what is industry doing? And I want to focus on the capability standard that was released yesterday. Rob and Doris, you spent a huge amount of time contributing to that. And I want to thank you guys publicly. It's been really exciting. And Rob, you led the first assessment using the model. So can I turn to both of you initially? Just give a little bit about what CDMC Cloud Data Management Framework is. And then I would talk about a little of the capabilities and share that with the rest of the panel. So I turn it over to you guys.
Doris, you want to go first?
Sure. So from my perspective, and again, not at my role at SG, I've been in the data office at more than just SG. When you have a well-defined data capabilities model, then you can follow basically an industry standard way of setting up the data office, doing your roles and responsibilities, managing the data. And it works very well with respect to your relationship, again, with your regulators, right? Because if you're doing something industry standard that's well accepted and proven over and over again, then the regulators are very happy to see what you're doing and you have big success internally. So I was very excited when the EDMC started to work on the cloud data management capabilities. I religiously used the DCAM model, as the Bible and best practices in data management. So now to have this cloud data management capabilities, again, continues that journey where you have industry best practices, not just the finance industry, right? There was participants from the cloud service providers, other technology firms and intermediaries, the finance industry and other industries as well, all putting their brains together and realizing we do have a common set of requirements and best practices on how to manage our data.
Yeah, Doris, I think we brought all of those competitors together and they left their business cards at the door, so to speak, right? Which was really an amazing experience.
Yeah, it really was. Yeah.
And to put this together, Rob, your KPMG led one of the first efforts with Snowflake, and that was announced. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so I think what's been interesting in the journey, and again, similar to Doris, having a significant background with DCAM and the structure and the framework. When we got involved and helped define CDMC and then got involved in this first assessment, what you're finding as we went through that process was the assumptions that when you look at the cloud, it does introduce all those uniquenesses about the cloud data management and what's important and all that sort of stuff. But as we went through that process, what was interesting too was the assumptions that you had to make that go back to just that foundational core good data management practice that you need, whether it's regardless of where you're storing your data. You just need good data management practices. And the cloud is another place where I'm going to go store the data, and there's uniquenesses that you need to pay attention to, and that's really what the CDMC is doing. But then there's a lot of assumptions that you make that I just need good data management practices. And if I don't have those good data management practices, if I'm in the cloud, it's just going to be that much more complex. So the interesting thing is how the two models that the council has with DCAM and CDMC and how they play each other. And it just emphasized in that exercise that we went through to certify, to review and assess how well that environment met the requirements. It makes you realize that we do have to have these things called strategies. We do have to think about why we go into this. We have to be deliberate about what we're doing. And that's really what these frameworks allow you to do. And to Doris's point, these are coming from industry teams. It's not coming from just one perspective. There's a lot of perspective. And it's been a fun journey to be on to help define it.
Yeah, and I want to direct to Matt and Nathan, but just to add some color to that, that was an 18-month journey with 300 people and 100 companies dedicating thousands of hours, which was an experience for us as a trade association. Our work groups have been, conservative and small, and so. But this was a tremendous effort by a lot of people putting a lot of time, and I think that was just a testament to what the outcome is. And to Nathan and Matt, what are you seeing with your clients from an adoption of standards perspective? Are we still kind of roll your own, or are firms gravitating towards, hey, let's use what industry is building? And Matt, I'll start with you, and then
I guess I can start. I know that when we work with clients, I might raise it up even one level higher than the CDMC, because that's a fantastic framework. It released this week, and it's awesome to be able to start adopting it. When we work with clients, we love to work through this framework of business data technology, and we acronymize it as BDT. We got to figure out what are the business use cases and problems that really matter, what's the data that's impacted by it, and then how can technology support that. So what's great about DCAM, what's great about the cloud data management capabilities released by the EDM Council is that it's a framework that can fit into these typical frameworks that we would already work with clients on anyway. There's kind of a matrix with the cliche of people, process, technology as well. Of course, the people, process, technology typically thinks more about the who and the how. Business data technology thinks about the what and the why. And then you have all of these excellent supportive frameworks from the EDM Council that can raise up into that and offer us more capabilities of working with our clients and partnering with our clients.
Nathan, I think one of the things that we discovered in this was when you bring a lot of smart people together, they think of things that you wouldn't have thought about. So when we looked at the cloud, something as simple as a catalog that's shared across multi-cloud environments. You need that, because how can you manage data unless you see the data, in one place? Or the challenge of where is the cloud provider putting my data? Rob, you mentioned about the ownership issue. In fact, I'm running a panel next week. The topic is ownership versus stewardship. That's an issue now, right? What are you handing off to the cloud?
Exactly.
And these are the things that were covered in the CDMC. Nathan, do you see those things advancing your work with your clients?
To some extent, but I think, this is kind of the thing that I was making in the introductory remarks, which is there's a difference, I think, between cloud strategy and data strategy leveraging cloud. And certainly when it comes to cloud strategy, I think some of the things that you've done at EDM Council with the CDMC, Matt, I think you rattled off a couple of BDT, the DCAM, everything else. They're all good when you're taking a look at the entire sort of enterprise strategy for data in the cloud. I think where we come from, though, is a little bit more of what is an outcome-based solution when you're looking for particular data types that feed into that larger strategy. And so for us, what I think clients are most interested in is in this particular patch around reference and pricing data and ESG and some of this other stuff. How can you help us transform this from an operational model, leveraging cloud, so that we have a data strategy that is helpful in moving not only our technical operations into a distributed mechanism, and that is leveraging cloud technology, but it is also a different type of relationship with the client in which we are now essentially the outsourced or the provider of this data strategy to the client. So I think
they are absolutely connected, right? You can't have, as Rob pointed out, you know, the idea of requiring or formalizing a strategy is, how many projects have you seen that get started and someone actually might ask, why are we doing this? What was the strategy behind it? No one took the time to actually articulate that, right? So the one thing I think that's really exciting about all of these standards is there's nothing earth-shattering in it, but it's the bringing the pieces together that benefits industry. Right now, you've got it all in front of you, and I think that's one of the biggest benefits. I know we're at the end of the session. Any closing comments? In fact, Doris, there was a question for you: is what was your biggest learning so far in the cloud journey? So I'll turn it over to each of you for a 30-minute comment, and Doris, if you can start with that one, and I'll pass it over to the others before we wrap.
So, John, I'm going to bring it to the CDMC effort because I think the biggest surprise, maybe not learning, is that we were able to work with the cloud providers to understand that, yes, I need that data catalog across Azure and across AWS, and they're going and building it. Like, that's a wow for me.
Great, thanks. Matt?
You know, thanks again for the opportunity here. I hope next year we're all in person doing this stuff, right? New York City and other cities, right? We'll be able to do Data Management Summit in person again. This recording is going to be available in the cloud, you know, from a data management perspective as well. Again, I think for us, it's just, you know, we love to help clients chip away at their strategy. I love to talk about there's got to be a why. Why are we doing it? Aim big, start small, chip away at it. It just takes time, and great things will come with it. And it's been a fun discussion. So thanks again.
Thanks. And Rob and Nathan, take us home. We got 30 seconds.
I think it's a learning evolution. I don't think they've, you know, you said, what are we learning from it? I think we're still learning. So I think that's going to be an ongoing process when you get to the cloud environment with the advances in the technology, the changes that the vendors are doing. There's still a lot to learn.
Nathan?
Yeah, I think, listen, I think it's, well, the interesting thing is you're going to see is I think in some ways this is going to be one of those opportunities for some of the smaller firms to leapfrog the larger firms. They'll be able to move faster and adopt the cloud infrastructure and move faster. So I think you're going to see that, and completely agree with Matt. I hope cloud does not, or this distributed capability does not impact us in the future from getting together and doing this in person. I certainly agree with the earlier points. I've gotten a lot smarter from participating in this panel. So thank you for having us.
So let me thank our panel. I hope to see you all in person next year. And let me turn it back to Sarah. If Sarah is there. There we go. You're on mute, Sarah. You're on mute. The wonders of
that's
there
better.
we go. Okay.
In person would be so much
thank you for
easier.
allowing us to have this panel. And again, thank you to my panelists.
Well,
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Joan, and your panel for a great and very interesting discussion on getting it right. There are obviously a lot of things to get through before you can do that.
Cheers,
And
everybody.
thank you. And at this point, I'd like to hand over hosting the event to my colleague, Andrew Delaney, President and Chief Content Officer at A-Team Group. Andrew.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everyone, for that great session. Yep, this is Andrew Delaney. I'd just like to echo what the guys were saying there. We wish we were there in person. All things equal. Hopefully, we'll be there next year and doing this live and in person. Yeah, that was a great session on cloud. Seems to be underpinning most of the things that we are doing these days. So I thought that was a very good discussion. Certainly the challenges some of us are facing there. So thanks to the panelists on that one and John Batega for of course, for moderating. Let's move on to our next item now, which is a keynote presentation from Nick Brandreth, Data Governance Consulting Manager at OneTrust. The title of Nick's presentation is Building a Path to Data Intelligence. And in this, he'll be discussing how organizations can embrace data intelligence using a central platform that integrates data privacy and security for core governance capabilities. He's going to look at how firms can leverage AI and ML for data discovery and classification. And finally, he'll offer some suggestions on how to embed policies into your data inventory to control data access, retention, and use. So let's hear from Nick now.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's session of Building a Path to Data Intelligence. This session is hosted by OneTrust, and thank you for joining us. I'm your speaker today. My name is Nick Brandreth. Lead one of the teams here in our data governance offering, and have been in the space for nearly 4 years now or so, speaking with a lot of practitioners, a lot of different organizations at various different levels of maturity, and a lot of thought leaders, which has really given me an opportunity to hear a lot of stories and really get a clear picture on some of the big challenges that organizations are facing and some of the steps they're taking to overcome those challenges and really help drive innovation of data within their organization while maintaining a level of trust. Prior to that, I spent about 17 years, give or take, in the information security space. For today's agenda, we're going to really walk through kind of 3 key areas. We're going to start off with the data landscape, which is a topic near and dear to my heart. And then following that, really talk about some of these keys that we see organizations implementing and looking at in order to help bridge this gap that they have. And we'll talk about that as part of the data landscape. And then we'll finish up by talking about how OneTrust really can help support and solve a lot of these problems and challenges that organizations are facing. Before I get started, just a quick reminder, there's a chat box there. Please feel free to use that chat box throughout the course of the presentation today to submit questions. We love lots and lots of questions, and any questions that we can't get to immediately, we'll definitely be following up with you on. So again, kind of jumping in, let's talk a little bit about data landscape. And this, I had mentioned, this is a topic near and dear to my heart. And there's a couple reasons why. If you think about data and the appetite that every organization now has in terms of being able to consume and leverage and utilize this data, it's grown exponentially. And really organizations are starting to realize or have realized that in order to really maintain any type of competitive edge or gain a competitive edge or enter into a new market, any of these types of things that it wants to do, it needs to be able to drive data-driven insights into the organization, which means they need to innovate with the data. And this is being asked for all across an organization. So you have sales who are looking to better understand and quantify leads or look at where possibly the best place to launch a new product is. Marketing is looking at better tailoring outreach and more personalized type of outreach, understanding how to better present the brand to its potential customer base. Operation teams are optimizing processes, supply chain logistics, trying to reduce costs and become a lot more efficient. And of course, you know, from a customer perspective, that customer interaction is so critical and so important. And doing that with speed and velocity and a personal touch is almost really expected given what the consumer experiences throughout, you know, their whole journey, their whole life journey. And all of these things kind of coupled together really drive the organization to want to leverage this type of data. And companies have done amazing things. There's been all this awesome innovative technology that's come out over the last, you know, decade, give or take, around data. You know, you've got the ability to really start leveraging more and more ML and AI to train algorithms. We're adopting big data systems, things like Snowflake and Databricks and whatnot. We're leveraging IoT data flowing into like S3 buckets or that type of thing. And due to this, the amount of data that an organization is consuming has grown exponentially. So there's a tremendous amount of data now. And not only is that data sitting in on-prem Oracle or DB2 type of databases anymore, that data is migrating out to the cloud. That data is moving into these large data lakes. That data is sitting out in data sources like a Salesforce or a Workday. And again, being pulled into various different types of data sources. We're not only using structured data, but we're really trying to leverage unstructured data more and more. So that data is being moved around to or being migrated from those legacy on-prem data shares that every organization seems to have up into things like OneDrive and whatnot. So you have this like tremendous amount of volume of data and this velocity and variety of data happening in the organization. And this starts creating a lot of risk where you may have data being shared in by business partners, and they may be sending you data that they shouldn't be sending you, or they may be sending you data that you consider restricted, and you have a policy in place that says, hey, all restricted data should be encrypted, but that data is being set in the clear, and you're really kind of blind to that because you're unaware of exactly what data is there. And we'll kind of touch into this a little bit more here in a minute. But on top of all this, you've got not just increasing cyber threat, but you've got this myriad of different types of data regulations out there. And they're coming out all the time, or they're changing, like CCPA to CPRA, which really creates a lot of challenge for the organization, because while they want to drive value and innovate with that data, there's so much risk from a compliance perspective that they really take a risk-adverse stance in terms of being able to leverage that data. For the most part, this is the way this teeter-totter typically looks. If not, it's unbalanced the other way. We really see this a lot when we're talking to organizations about some of these big data platforms like the Snowflakes and the Databricks and whatnot, where they are moving a lot of data there, or even Hadoop, right? They are moving a lot of data there, but the access to that data is slow. The leveraging of that data is slow because they don't really understand the risks, so they're much more risk adverse to that data. A lot of that kind of couples in with the misunderstanding of the data as well. And that's really what a unified governance strategy, what I like to call true data intelligence, gives you, is this ability to move from a posture of being risk adverse to a posture of being risk aware, while being able to drive agility into that data usage, right? Continuous innovation and agility into the data usage. And this is really the goal that we see a lot of organizations starting to strive for, where they see these two being very hand in hand and coupled. And we'll touch more on why this is a big challenge for organizations here in a minute, which really leads us to some of these keys. And these are different pieces that we've seen organizations, practices that we've seen organizations put in place to really help create a faster path to data intelligence, right? Kind of making sure that they're not putting the cart before the horse. And before I jump into these, just as a reminder, please feel free to use that chat box and drop any questions in there that you may have up to this point. So let's look at these three key points, and we'll dig into each one of these in a minute here. But just at a high level, really an organization needs to first truly know what data they have and where, so they can kind of help mitigate that drift challenge that they may face and to mitigate the risk. They need to understand that data holistically. What does that data mean to my organization? How am I processing it? What does it mean if I want to process it for a new business purpose? And finally, being able to unify tools and processes across that kind of spectrum so that they're not siloed out. So we're not looking at the risk to data in one bucket and access to data and usage of data and how the organization can better leverage that data in another bucket. So let's start off with understanding truly knowing your data. And this really means that organizations need to do a very deep level of discovery of this data that goes beyond metadata. And I'll give you a great example of this. If you're solely relying on metadata, then you will miss certain types of data that's in the environment due to the velocity of data And due to the little things like open text fields or freeform text fields, where you have a salesperson dumping data into a comments field or something like that, like I'm going to buy Michael lunch on Friday, make sure a kosher option is available. This creates a lot of problems for organizations. So being able to go out and discover that data at the data element level, picking up key attributes about that data with both structured, unstructured data, semi-structured data on the prem, in the cloud, across these big data computing platforms, and at scale is a very, very critical, important need for an organization. And to do that, they need to adopt the same types of big data computing concepts that they're using. The second component is understanding that data holistically. And that really gets down to being able to truly accurately classify the data for the organizations, both from a risk perspective and from a usage perspective. Whether that's PI or sensitive PI, behavioral related type of data, being able to understand those types of data and being able to look at that data from both a deterministic and a probabilistic perspective. Personal health information is a really, really great example here where you could do clinical research around this data, but certain types of data can only be used in certain types of way, right? Mental health data is a really good example of that. So really nailing that classification is a super key critical step, and being able to automate that through discovery as well is as equally important. And finally, going and looking at this from a unified perspective, right? This kind of new view of data governance where it's more than just managing that metadata to the usage of that data for the organization. It's managing that metadata to better be aware of the risk and to react quickly in terms of how the organization can manage the risk while better leveraging the data. And if you look at the way most organizations have done this historically, and really for the most part, the technologies are still doing it this way as well, is they're looking at these in separate silos. And this creates a really big problem because there starts to become a disconnect between the usage of that data and what does that mean from a risk perspective? What does that mean from a records of processing activities perspective? And how are we auditing and showing and proving compliance when a regulator may come in asking us about these various different processes? Organizations really need to combine these and look at these as part of the same continuum, because they truly are. As we go through and look at accessing data, what does that mean from a business purpose perspective? And what does that mean from a risk perspective? Let me give you kind of an example of this. So first, let's say the business wants to use customer data for a new business purpose that it wasn't initially collected for. First, that business needs to submit a PIA, right? Because it's a new purpose that it's processing that business for. And then check the ROPA to understand what that means from a legal basis. And then from there, they need to update any policies, ensure certain types of data isn't being used, or whatever it may be that helps mitigate that risk pertaining to that data processing. And perhaps that might be getting new consent or updated consent for the new use of that data from that particular individual or that consumer base. And once that PIA is approved, at that point, then access can be given, and the understanding of where to go get that data is there as well. This is a really good example of kind of the complexity of this flow and why organizations need to unsilo these various different programs and really view it more as part of the same continuum. So let's spend a couple minutes talking about how OneTrust helps organizations achieve this. First, it all starts with scanning the data at the data discovery level. We can go out across cloud, on-prem, any type of data type, and scan that data at that data element level at scale. And we can do this because we leverage a lot of the same computing concepts that these big data platforms are using. Once we do that, we automatically create a data dictionary. So that's auto-populated. And from there, those various different types of inventories are created to kind of start building out that catalog from which we can start applying the various different types of business semantics to those technical terms as well, which leads to the ability to better govern that data, right? Help define risk, understand the risk to that data, understand those policies. Do I have data that needs to be encrypted and isn't? And then build out that knowledge graph, which gives you that ability to go out and mitigate risk to that data, understand if you've got data in systems that it shouldn't be in, understand if certain types of data is being used that shouldn't be used. And this really puts you on the path to true data intelligence. I thank you again for your time today. Really appreciate you joining us. If you have any questions, please feel free to request resources. And again, drop those questions in the chat window. Thank you.
Thank you to Nick at OneTrust there. Great presentation, some really interesting and thoughtful or thought-provoking messages there. So really appreciate that. I believe that there are a few questions in Slido, and I think the guys from OneTrust are going to be answering those in due course. So keep an eye on the Slido there. And in the meantime, we will move on to our next session, which is a panel discussion around the science of data discovery and the art of implementation for business value. We are, as you may have noticed, mixing things up a little bit today. We like to move things around sometimes. And so for this session, I'm handing back the moderation duties to Sarah. So that's Sarah Underwood of 18 Group. And I notice a bunch of my good friends from New York on this session. Hi guys, great to see you. Look forward to next year's when we can get together and catch up and hear about all your lockdown adventures. Anyway, on that note, let's hear about data discovery and so on. Over to you, Sarah.
Thanks, Andrew. And yes, indeed, our next panel covers the science of data discovery and the art of implementation for business value. I'll ask our experts to introduce themselves briefly, and just a quick reminder to our delegates that you can, of course, respond to our poll questions on the panel to the right of your video. And there you will also find a box to put your questions to our experts. We'll ask them throughout the panel, so we don't get to the end and have no time left for them. So just post them there, and we'll answer as many as we can as we go along. So let me start by asking our panelists to introduce themselves and their firms briefly. Brian, would you like to start?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Brian Greenberg. I am the business enablement lead in our enterprise data management group here at BNY Mellon. I work with the various lines of business and the chief data officers of those business lines to implement enterprise data strategy.
Thank you very much indeed. And over to you, Randy.
Hi, I'm Randy Gordon. I work in the Data Governance Office of Citi Private Bank, which is part of Citi Global Wealth. And my focus is on implementing the enterprise data governance program within Private Bank, make sure we're in compliance, and also working with the business itself to look for opportunities to maximize the use of data for business growth and new opportunities.
Thank you very much indeed. And Fiona.
Hello, everyone. My name's Fiona, and I head up the machine learning team at Detactics. We specialize in data quality, preparation, and matching at scale. And we have clients in the finance and governmental sectors. And we help our clients with things like monitoring, measuring their data quality through to tasks such as compliance to regulations and single customer view.
Thank you. And over to you, Linda.
Hello there, Sarah. Hello, everyone. I'm Linda Kaufman. I am Executive Vice President at Smartstream Technologies for the RDU business line, the reference data utility. Happy to be here today.
Thank you. And Peggy.
Hi, everyone. My name is Peggy Tsai. I'm the VP of Data Solutions at Big ID. Big ID is a machine learning discovery platform where we help to discover and automate the data insights that can be connected through all your data sources. I focus on our product strategy and our data.
Okay, thank you all very much indeed. And let's move on to the questions. And coming to you first, Brian, how would you define data discovery and its potential benefits?
Oh, I'm sorry. My screen just did something very strange. One second.
I can see you.
There we go. Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah. So when it comes to data discovery, certainly here at BNY Mellon, what we've noticed most is the need to identify authoritative sources of data. The consumers of data historically within the firm have been responsible not only for producing whatever reports or dashboards they're producing, but also identifying the right data to use to create those dashboards, those reports. And as you can imagine, if you leave it up to the consumers to identify the right place, different consumers are going to identify different sources. And with that comes inaccuracy, it comes duplication, it comes dozens or hundreds of reconciliation processes that need to be done to make sure that one report matches the other, et cetera. So, from my perspective, the most important thing we could do around data discovery is to identify for each business function or each capability, what is the authoritative source of the data? Where should everyone be going? Because if everyone uses the same source, then there's no need for reconciliation, right? And who knows what the authoritative source of the data is? The people who produce that data, right? So we've gone back to the data producers. We've given them a mountain to stand on and a megaphone to shout through, and they can say, this is the authoritative source of pricing data or of transaction data or what have you. They make that known to everyone who wants to consume data. And we create a catalog or a glossary of those data sets, and we allow folks who need to consume data to have a central place to go do that search. So that's been our focus over the last 6 to 9 months. We've had a great deal of success with that regard, and I've seen regulatory programs, I've seen large change efforts streamline their data sourcing strategies and generate more accurate, more complete data just by knowing the right place to go.
Okay, thank you very much. And Linda, coming to you, Brian has discussed some of the things that they've been doing and how good it has been. Where do you see the benefits in data discovery?
I think it really can be tied back to dollars, which we all like to do. So from a cost perspective, we've seen where there's multiple user groups paying for the same data, right? Because there's not an authoritative source. So you have somebody sourcing a certain set of data, maybe from one provider, another sourcing the same set of data from another provider. You have multiple. So if you have that data discovery process down, then that's not going to happen. You have multiple operations teams, front, middle, back office, managing the same set of data. So, and trying to interpret it. One person can interpret value, a field coming from the same provider as one thing in the front office, another thing in the middle office, another thing in the back office. So when you have that cataloging done right that Brian described, you no longer get into that inconsistency, which then leads to breaks and operational overhead. And then lastly, I would say true business value. So I'm sure Peggy's going to talk a lot about this maybe in some of her responses, but if you are investing in AI and you're investing in a bunch of shiny tools that use and depend on that data, by not having a clear understanding and ownership of the data and being able to do data discovery to understand what your firm actually has in-house, you're not going to get the best value from all of the fancy bells and whistles that you're developing. And so I think that true business value will come from being able to understand the data in-house and do proper data discovery.
Thank you. Peggy, what would you add there? I think you take a slightly wider view here.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Brian and Linda are saying. They're mentioning about creating a catalog, certainly for, the importance of identifying authoritative data sources. But just to take a step back, before even building that catalog, it's the inventorying process. It's the ability to really look through your entire data landscape and being able to automatically identify the new data that comes in and be able to process it and catalog it correctly. So I would say that data discovery is a foundational part of any data management program, but it's also a fairly new concept, I think, for many organizations to take on formally in their data governance program. So a lot of customers that we look at today, they're challenged by, similar with Brian, many growing data sets, challenges with scaling their organization as they grow into new product lines, new regions, geography regions. So being able to really understand and automate the identification of new data is really the biggest challenge. I love Linda's response about benefits. It is all about dollars, but if you look across the organization, it's not just the chief data officer that has to be concerned with data discovery. It's also the responsibility of the chief privacy officer and the chief security officer. And if you look about in terms of security, they've been around for a long time now, looking at classifying, finding data, sensitive data, and being able to be compliant for data access and being in compliance with GDPR and CCPA. So really the benefits, the purpose of data discovery is shared amongst many C-suite executives. So really thinking about the concepts of data discovery and being able to scale it across many business teams and many business stakeholders.
Okay, great start. Thank you. And let's ask our first audience question. It's a poll question, and it asks, what are the challenges of data discovery at your organization? You can select as many of the options as you like. And while you do that, let me come back to Peggy, who touched on challenges a moment ago, but get you round up on that, Peggy. Where do you see the challenges of getting data discovery right?
Thanks, Sarah. I really see two main challenges here. So when I think about data discovery and how to really get it right, I like to compare and contrast that with the concept of data quality. So if you ask any organization, how do you do data quality, there's automatically a handbook. There's a process and procedure about how to do data quality. But if you ask organizations, how do you procedurally do data discovery, I think there's a bit more hesitation on how that's done. And I think it's really important that data discovery is not a standalone exercise that's done by your technology team or your architecture team. Really has to be embraced by the business stakeholders, because data discovery needs to be embraced, enriched, verified by your data stewards, your business stakeholders, really validating the information that is discovered and put into a catalog or inventory. And I think another second challenge I like to say is just the perception of what data discovery is. And I think data discovery is not a magic bullet. It's not going to be a 100% perfect way of finding and identifying all your data perfectly. I think in the past, a lot of the misconceptions has been around the fact that there have been a lot of false positives around data discovery tools. There's been a lot of limitations in terms of technology, really only looking at regular expression or exact pattern matching. And I think that's where a lot of the inaccuracies around some of the data discovery tool results have been. So there's been some concerns about leveraging automation and machine learning for data discovery. So really thinking about in context of having data discovery as part of a holistic data governance program, having the right people, the right subject matter experts to participate in this process is really critical to making data discovery successful in any organization.
Thank you. And coming to you, Randy, what would you add here in terms of challenges? You're a practitioner, so you've had to take these on. So what do you say?
Sure, thanks. And I'll pick up on some of Peggy's points for, I think, some practical challenges I think any large financial institution is going to face. One is the sheer volume and variety of the data. You not only have all types of data, but you have data for all types of customers, all types of products, right? Consumer products, commercial products. That makes understanding the context of the data really critical and difficult. And I'll give you a real live example I once ran into was I was trying to upload a file from an institutional credit system, and the scanning software, I don't know what tool was in use, actually picked up on the fact that there were credit card numbers in the file, except they weren't credit card numbers. They were 16-digit internal instrument identifiers. Now that's an interesting discovery, right? But if you think about what's needed to put that into context and understand this data is actually commercial rather than consumer, and the factors that might go into making that determination, that's complex, and that's just part of what one would run into with a global bank. But also along with that, if a global bank is looking for a global solution and looking to inventory data globally, then you're going to have to run into cross-border regulations and working through cross-border permissions. And that gets to not only accessing the data, but where the data you're extracting for analysis will go, where the software is run, where the data is stored. And I've been through that process. That's very complex and time consuming. So that is certainly a challenge I think a global institution faces.
Thank you. Fiona, what would you add?
So I'm actually thinking of our clients, and we often see a spectrum of capabilities and where institutions are in terms of their maturity and their data journey as well. So I think that sort of then highlights other areas that Randy and Peggy have highlighted in terms of, where you are with your data governance framework. Are you at the start of your journey, or are you well established with that? Right through to data quality. And actually often, we're asked by clients, what's my data, or what data quality rules should I be using as well. So feeding that type of information in, and then it goes right back to the first part of the discussion in terms of talking about assignment of ownership and responsibility of the data, right through to security and accessibility. And then understanding those regulations and legal implications and security of your data as well. And I really like the point that Randy had raised in terms of context and the importance of trying to embed this context, especially whenever you are trying to discover data, within your lake, for example, and uncover those relationships and make use of things like your metadata catalogs and building that out to build that context in.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And let's look at the poll results and see what our audience is thinking in terms of challenges. Okay, Randy, can I come back to you? You talked about the challenges you've come across. How do the stats look to you?
I think this is very interesting. It's interesting that the most frequent response was no single source of truth. I think that's the nature of a large institution. So part of what you're discovering is the variety of sources of potential truth. So I think that would be a natural issue to hit initially, but I think that's part of what data discovery can help with exactly, is identifying all the different sources of the same data and then working through that to identify what should be the source of truth. So that's really interesting.
Yeah, I'll
Okay.
if I could jump in, Sarah.
Sure.
This is heartening to me to see this result, because it suggests that we're moving down the right path. There are, as Randy said, there are multiple sources. All of us have multiple sources of the same data, right? And there are tools that we've been discussing that can automate the discovery of those and the reconciliation of those, et cetera. But at the end of the day, as I said earlier, the people who know what the authoritative source is are the people who produce the data. And what I found is, somewhat surprisingly, I guess, this is not a controversial question. Right. If I produce, a particular, say I produce FX transactions, I know exactly what the authoritative source is for FX transactions. There's no debate. If anyone asked me, I would always give the same answer. The trick is getting people to ask me, as opposed to asking other colleagues or other people that have found other sources and have had success. And, use this system because I've used it in the past, it worked for me, et cetera. And so, what I would suggest and encourage is, automate, absolutely, but don't leave out the human experience at the source, right? Let's find out where the right places are, where the right authoritative sources are, and then use those sources as input to all these tools, right? When we establish our glossaries, we populate our data lakes, and we identify what the consumable data sets are available. Start with what the people producing the data are telling you the right places to go. And then what falls out of that is all of the non-authoritative sources, all of the ones that are aggregators or created for particular use cases, et cetera. And we can drive people away from those sources towards the authoritative sources. And some of our problems start to get smaller. Some of our reconciliation issues, some of our AI tools that need to differentiate between sources suddenly have an easier job because we're identifying some certainties that allow us to have better inputs into those models.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And let's move on to our next question. And can I come to you, Linda, to tell us a little bit about holistic approaches that can be taken to resolve these kinds of challenges?
Yeah, I think that allowing users to, you do all this work, and Brian's been describing some of the activities that they're working on, and that makes sense. But then how do you, as he just mentioned, bring in the human experience? So giving users an easy way to see the data even before it's integrated maybe into your more wide user platforms, right? So if you're getting data from source A and B, and maybe you've only integrated 3/4 of that into your data lake or into your security master, but the user is now wanting to understand about that 25%. Usually catalogs stop short, or I've seen catalogs stop short at what is available in-house that you can access through the normal chains of command. And being able to make the data, kind of give them a sandbox, a data sandbox to play in, to say, hey, we do have these other data values. So when you're developing your models, when you're developing your whatever product you're doing, if you give them access to that and kind of a play area, then they help to define the authoritative source for you almost as they bring more and more data attributes into scope. So I think that's one, giving them access to that. Better cross-referencing, believe it or not, between data providers so that users don't feel boxed into one provider. So if you, sometimes you see these kind of non-authoritative source pockets of data happening because either they couldn't get what they wanted from the authoritative source, or they couldn't connect the dots. So they just pushed over to another source that isn't the authoritative source for the firm, maybe worse quality, so they're spending more money cleansing it. But if you can help them connect the dots between sources, I think that also helps. And then my last one is clear and clean definition. So my example that I give that stuck with me over the years is we had one organization where one of their data providers, authoritative sources, had a field called country, right? Just country. And there were about 10 different users all thinking of this, interpreting this value differently. So some it was country of the issuer, some it was country of the trade, where the trading's happening, some country where the parent company was domiciled. I mean, you name it. And it was the one field. So having that, we keep talking about the catalog, we're getting boring talking about catalogs all the time, but having that clear, concise definition available to everybody so there's not that misinterpretation, I think holistically will drive better efficiencies.
Thank you, Linda. And Fiona, what would you add there in terms of approaching these challenges?
Yeah, so a very broad approach would firstly be embedding that culture of data responsibility and understanding within an organization. So that goes from your C-suite executives right down to your data engineers and on the technical side as well, and having that as a priority and an impetus as opposed to like a checkbox exercise. So that's a rather broad stroke and not something that's very simply resolved. And that includes, skilling up and training, because this area is constantly changing. Regulations are updating and changing. For example, we've got the potential of new AI regulations from the EU coming down the line. Keeping an eye on best practices. Security is always moving and keeping up to date with that, and privacy. And I think of what we've touched on as well as accountability is key. So, assigning those roles and responsibilities. So as Brian was saying, we know who the key owner of this one single data set of truth is. And then I suppose, I think Peggy will probably talk about this in terms of the data governance. So you've got many policies, and it's maybe integrating these policies. So you've got policies around data privacy, ethics, security, and quality, and so on, and having a holistic view of those. And then finishing off with best practices that Linda's highlighted really well in terms of having, your standardized data model across a company. That's a really interesting example of the country field there, Linda, through to, building your data catalogs, categorizing your data in terms of risk, in terms of regulation, and so on as well. So broad strokes down to best practices.
Okay, that's great. We have a couple of audience questions, I think probably for our practitioners. And I'm going to put the first one to you, Brian. And it asks, how can we control data discovery to make sure the data isn't duplicated? We don't end up with different versions of the same data and so on. In other words, how do we make sure it's not a mess?
Right. Yeah, no, it's a great question. So we've established a certification process with strong governance around it. Like I said, we start with the producers. And so the question really boils down to what happens if two producers both claim to be the authoritative source of the same data, right? If it's one producer and they have two different sources, then frankly, they need to pick one, right? Where would you send people if asked, right? But if two people both believe they're the same, they're the authoritative source, then that's highlighting an inherent issue within the organization that needs to be resolved, right? And then the governance process can kick in, bring those two groups together, and let's just agree where should we be sending people when they need this type of data, right? And it's also very important to cut it not too fine and not too coarse, right? What is the business concept or business function that we are describing? Linda's example is a great one, right? So, country data, regions, internal legal entities, et cetera. Some of this stuff is the purview of the client data team or the KYC team. Some of it's the purview of legal or finance, right? And so that data might exist in both of those places, and they need to agree on who's going to be the authoritative source and who's going to be what we call an authorized provisioning point, right? Who's going to be a place you can go, but what they're doing is they're giving you the data from the authoritative source. So, long answer, but the short summary is governance and, constant communication and dialogue with the producers to agree on the right answer.
Okay, thank you, Brian. Coming to you, Randy. This is perhaps a little tricky, but let's see how it goes. And it says, handling sensitive data and upholding PII is a big concern, but we have a limited budget. How should we make the business case for these types of tools?
Well, I think institutions are aware of the penalties that are involved if that data is not handled correctly. And they're also aware of their particular data landscape in terms of how sprawling it may be, right? So I think starting with the business case that you need to understand where this data is, first and foremost. I mean, governance and all that, I think, comes from first knowing where it is. So the work involved in trying to do this without such a tool, the kinds of tools we're talking about, data discovery tools, is immense. And you can work up, I think, a cost benefit argument that doing that manually or doing that through custom queries or however is going to cost a lot in resources and time. And so, and it's not going to be sustainable. And you have to be able to sustain this. Your infrastructure is always changing. Your data structure is always changing. So I actually think there's a very compelling case to be made. If you just start with that, start with it's critical, you know where your PII is. And there's no alternative in a cost-effective way to do this without such a tool.
Okay, thank you. I think, Linda, it was you who mentioned cross-referencing data sources. And the question is, if I'm correct, could you talk about the types of tools and techniques you have used to help users cross-reference the data sources? Are these about conversations or fields in a catalog?
A little bit about both. So depending on what the set of data is, it brings on its own challenges as far as cross-referencing goes. We tend to do more, financial instrument cross-referencing, but we have found that automating that cross-referencing and putting a nice data quality program around it has allowed for clients to be able to easily maneuver between different sources of data, and it hasn't boxed them in. And so I think that it's definitely a combination. I tend to always lean in that everything's a combination of human expertise and machine automation. But for cross-referencing, a lot of it can be automated.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for your questions. And we're going to ask you now to fill in the answers to another poll question. This time, how integrated are data consumers like data scientists with business teams at your organization? And while you answer the question, let me ask Randy to talk about the role of data consumers, data scientists being one example in data discovery as opposed to data producers. These terms have come up already. How do you see it?
So I think this is a really interesting question. And I'm going to answer it based on how I can ideally see data consumers using these tools. I haven't necessarily had the opportunity myself, but getting back to one of Linda's ideas of having a sandbox, I think if you gave data consumers, including data scientists, the access to this discovered data that they can't have access to, obviously, permissions need to be in place. And then I think it's really important to encourage users, the consumers, to ask open-ended questions about the data, because I think that's where the real value can come. So instead of just asking for, okay, where's PII, where are 16-digit numbers, that's important information. But if you want to start extracting value, the questions should be more open-ended. I was thinking of, tell me where all the examples are of unique identifiers for individual customers. Because we know in most institutions, there are multiple identifiers for customers. There are external identifiers and regulatory identifiers and various internal identifiers, and some are legacy and some are up to date. But that's really interesting information. That can give you insights into customers, give you insights into how to become more efficient. Where you seem to have customers you can't identify, and now you know. So that's an open-ended question. I think on the producer side, getting back to that comment about, I think, Linda, you made about accurate metadata. I think it's really important for data producers to provide descriptions of data and whatever metadata repository they're using that really are filled with business meaning, because that will allow your data discovery tools to more accurately understand what this data is, what these data sources hold.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Brian, what would you add to that in terms of data consumers?
I think I agree with a lot of what Randy said, all of what Randy said, obviously. The thing I would add, I think, is around the type of consumer you're dealing with. I've noticed as we start to populate our glossary and our catalog and some of the other tools we're talking about here, there's a distinction between the more technical consumer and the more business-minded consumer. So, I'd be mindful of, if someone is going and searching for FX transactions, I'll use my example from before, and what they get back from their search is a set of table names and column names, as opposed to data sets, as opposed to definitions of the data. Linda made the point about what do we mean by country, that kind of thing. I think you can very easily provide a lot of information to people without providing a lot of knowledge, wisdom, or insight, right? So there's a distinction between that kind of that raw technical data that a lot of these tools kind of live and breathe in, and what some of the consumers are looking to gather. Data scientists, an interesting mix of that paradigm, right? There are certainly those who really want to get into down to the data, the columns and the tables and the columns and the metadata, et cetera. And then there are some that really need the definitions and the functional understanding of what they're looking at in order to populate their models correctly, right? So I think separating out what the tools are looking at versus what they're producing is a key piece when dealing with the consumers.
Thank you. Let's look at the poll results, if we may, and see how integrated the consumers are, the data consumers are with the business teams. Right. Peggy, would you like to comment on those results?
It's really interesting. I mean, there's clearly, the first choice integration is limited to a limited extent. To work together occasionally. So that just shows to me that there's still a gap, right, between the data consumers are with the actual business teams. So I think closing that gap is really key here for the holistic governance that we're all talking about today.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And let's move on. We're coming near to the end of our time. So let's run through some of the technologies, tools and solutions that can be helpful here with data discovery. Fiona, would you like to start?
Yeah. So there really is a rainbow of tools and solutions. So here goes. But it really, again, depends on where you are in your data discovery journey, and also maybe how much expertise and technology you have, for example, in-house already. So you've got a real range from data lineage and visualization tools, and we can see how a lot of these tools are being augmented. For example, data lineage being augmented with data quality metrics as it flows through an institution. Then technology to aid, for example, with metadata management. So maybe adding in more of that contextual information that Randy has been discussing on here. And then the use of natural language processing approaches to then pick out that contextual information. But again, it really all depends on having good quality contextual data already stored within your system in order to do that. No-code platforms to help subject matter experts with things with measuring, monitoring their data quality, improving their data quality. Right through to things like graphs and graph analysis to uncover potential links and relationships between data as systems get larger and more complex. And then the use of machine learning to augment. I really liked what Linda was saying about, that human in the loop approach as well. So augmenting things like classification of data, uncovering dependencies, recommending data sets to users and so on. So a real spectrum of approaches there.
Thank you. Peggy, what would you advise here?
So first and foremost, Big ID is a discovery solution that leverages AI machine learning. But a lot of the times when I talk to customers, new customers about what are they looking for in a data discovery tool, there's some standard questions I like to always ask them is, are you ensuring that the technology that you're looking at can connect to all your different types of data sources? So we're not just talking about a scope of structured data. There's unstructured, there's documents, PDF files, emails, messaging, data pipelines, data movement to the cloud. So there's different types of data that needs to be part of the scope of governance. And I think that ensuring that your solution has that broad coverage for all your applications and all your data sources is key. The second thing is not just finding the data. I think Randy and Fiona said it best, is finding the right data in the right context. And I think there's a lot of nuances in new technologies, natural language processing, as well as being able to really identify not just the metadata, but the understanding the data itself and being able to learn from your organization's data, as well as being able to leverage a lot of industry data sets out there to help automatically label and classify the data. It's really key to help with data discovery and really understand the right context. Certainly, Fiona and I, we come from more of a data science background, so there's a lot of technical techniques here that can really be established in terms of looking at, data similarities, clustering of data, being able to tie and trace the data across different data silos. I think those are all key to helping unlock the data discovery story here today.
Thank you. And Linda, what would you suggest here?
I think everybody's touched on so many. I don't know if I have much to add. I guess I would circle back to earlier when I was talking about the sandbox, but we have one client in particular that I really love what they did with virtualization and making it easy for downstream users, as I mentioned before, to access all the data that's available. And one thing that we didn't touch on is the procurement piece of this, right? So oftentimes you could buy a package of data and there's data available to your firm and you don't really know that you're paying for that data. So making sure that when you're doing your data discovery that you include the market procurement team in the mix is quite important. I know I'd sidetracked a little from tools there, but I just was thinking about that. So I would say virtualization tools, everything that Fiona and Peggy mentioned, plus I think more on the virtualization side, especially if you're talking to your tech, as Brian said, there's the tech and the business side of things. So if you're talking to the tech side, they love APIs, they love virtualization where they could just get their hands on the data and start playing with it. And then, of course, everything that was mentioned around context and making sure that the business side also has that access.
Thank you very much indeed. We have a rather last minute audience question. And Randy, I'm going to put this one to you again as a practitioner. Here we go. We are trying to get better control over our unstructured data, but the data volumes we have to handle are very large and our data is stored in many different repositories. Can you share any tips on how to approach this? Is a centralized approach best?
I think a centralized approach is best, but it's a big challenge. I think of experiences we've had in some of my former companies, just sorting through shared folders and SharePoint sites. I think that's where you have to ultimately, whatever your tool, really rely on the human aspect, because unstructured data, it's very hard to pin down sometimes, very hard to pin down where it came from, what exactly is in it. And what we did, I think, at one of my former companies, we basically identified owners for each of these repositories of unstructured data, and they were ultimately responsible for having the answers that we couldn't get from whatever software we were using to do discovery. I just think that's the nature of unstructured data. It's very hard to read.
Okay, anybody like to add a comment there?
I'll just throw in, sometimes unstructured data is supporting documentation and it's intended to be unstructured. You need repositories, you need search tools, et cetera. And sometimes unstructured data is structured data hiding in unstructured containers, right? And if that's what you're looking at, if you've got a document you're trying to pull data out of, I would look to some of the tools we're discussing here and, step one, convert that unstructured data into the structured data you need, and then proceed from there. Don't try to have a kind of a broad approach to unstructured data without considering what you want it to be, right? I would start there.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And we've just got a couple of minutes. So a sentence from everybody, please, about what we'll be talking about in terms of data discovery and its associated and analytics, perhaps next year. Where shall we start? Brian.
oh, what are we going to talk about next year? Hopefully, we'll be talking about how good it is to be in the same room.
And that.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, I think, as is mostly the case, it's about moving from information to knowledge and then to wisdom, right? We're making great strides, and we've got some great tools now to get rid of the reconciliations, to get the data, to get the authoritative sources in one place, and to get it out to the people. And now it's a question of how are they going to use it, and how can we help them use it in the best way. So hopefully, some of the things we're discussing now as kind of solved but not yet implemented problems are now implemented and passed. And now we're talking about the next hill to climb. That's my goal. That's my hope anyway.
Thanks. Randy, a few words from you here.
Well, what I'd like to see is that we have discussions about pooling the individual learnings, because any machine learning tool, each customer has to go through teaching it. I think if there's a way to generalize those learnings, especially about context, and find a way to pull that as a library that all users can access. I know the IP considerations are going to be very complex, but you're getting from machine learning to a learned machine then. And I think that's a really exciting place to go.
Thank you. Fiona, what do you see going forward?
I love that idea, Randy, because we build machine learning models, and that's one of the hardest part is building your data set. So I think that's a fantastic idea. And actually within the next year, it would be great to see us moving along in terms of augmenting the data discovery process with machine learning to address those rather manual, time-consuming tasks with those learnings. So that's a great view of the year.
Thank you. Linda, a few words from you too, please.
Yeah, I think we're all saying automation is going to be a big piece of the puzzle, no matter how you slice or dice it. And I think that we're going to find that the reason that everything is that there are no authoritative sources at some firms, or that we're struggling to do that, is that the information flow from the users inward is not clear all the time. So I would like to see, the automation being driven not just from owner out, but also from consumer in. So I'm hoping that we see tools take that into account more often.
Thank you. And some final words from you, Peggy.
So Randy, I really like your idea, and I'm going to see how I can put that into a product roadmap. But I think as more organizations really mature in their data discovery, I think embedding those insights directly into the end user, directly into the hands of the data scientists, the ones that are actually manipulating and reporting on the data, is really key. We don't want that friction between actually discovering, cataloging, all that curation work to be a hurdle for our data consumers. So really making that seamless and making this a really easy process for our end users to ultimately do their actions, take actions, and get the data intelligence that they need. So really helping to further along the data discovery is something I really see it's going to happen in the next year or two.
Thank you, and thank you all very much for taking part in this panel. And now it's time for me to hand back over to Andrew.
Hi guys, thank you, Sarah. Great session. Yes, we all lament not meeting in the same room, but I think we've got a purpose here. We can all get together next year and revisit Randy's big idea on learning machines. So perhaps that's something we can all look forward to. Let me see where we're at. Yes, we're gonna change tack a little bit now. We're often talking at data management summits about managing huge cost centers, databases, and technologies for managing data. But this session we're gonna look at things a little differently, and we're gonna look at ways to e-commerce e-commerce your data, turn your data into successful data products. So all that hard work of managing your data, putting a data strategy in place, perhaps now's the time to look at adopting new technologies in the form of data marketplaces to create data products from your internal data and put them out into the marketplace. So that's the premise for our next session. I will ask our expert speakers to introduce themselves in just a moment, but just wanted to remind you that we will be using Slido for questions and polls. I know you've been using that already, apparently successfully, so I won't dwell on it, but please do feel free to add questions and to participate in the polls that we're going to run in this session. So let me start things off before we get into the discussion and ask our panel members to introduce themselves. Let me start with you, Nicholas Doyen of TickSmith.
Hi, everybody. My name is Nicholas Doyen. I'm the head of product at TickSmith. At TickSmith, we build a platform that enables organizations to create their own data marketplaces and data web stores. Our platform is used by many financial institutions, large across the world, including the CME Group, Candial, and some other big banks and institutions in Europe. The platform supports use cases such as public data web stores, private data web stores, data clean rooms, et cetera. So we're constantly powering organizations to e-commerce their data, as Andrew said.
Great, thank you, Nicholas. Next up, let me ask Andre Craig of Candial to introduce himself.
Hello there. This is one of my favorite topics. So I head up the Candial DNA business Canada here. Our job is to pool dealer OTC over-the-counter data to provide market risk and reference pricing solutions. TickSmith, as Nicholas mentioned, has been an important early partner for us to help do that and pool data. And we've actually been quite successful over the last few years working with the dealers to commercialize data. And I have some interesting tidbits to share.
Great, thank you very much, Andre. Next up, Samantha Campbell of Alchemy. Welcome, Sammy.
Hi, nice to be here. So Samantha Campbell, founder, CEO of Alchemy. We've been working in the data monetization space for the last few years. We've focused previously more so on the data vendor and now more so on the demand side, so buyers for alternative data.
Very good, thank you very much. And finally, Rezo Sabo of Illuminate Financial, welcome.
Thank you, and welcome everyone. Great to be here. I'm Rezo, an investor at Illuminate, which is a venture capital fund focusing on enterprise software with a financial markets use case. Our backers are institutions like JP Morgan, Barclays, IHS Markit, and the Deutsche Börse Group, amongst others. And we really invest in late seed Series A businesses that benefit the financial industries. Have been investing in data infrastructure, analytics, amongst many other things, and that's the lens I'm wearing. It's the early stage investor.
Very good. Thank you very much. Before we get going, I'd like to draw the audience's attention to, I believe there should be a white paper available for download that we've worked with TickSmith on some of the concepts that we're going to discuss on this panel. So do feel free to download that paper. Maybe wait till we finish with the discussion so you don't get distracted. But anyway, some bedtime reading for you all, and I think it's quite good stuff, and we'll delve into some of the issues we're talking about here. So we're going to kick off, as I promised, with a poll. So if you will, please open up your Slidos. The poll question is, do you have a data monetization strategy in place? Now, I'm not going to hold my breath because I saw an earlier question touch on this earlier in today's show, where I think perhaps 15% of respondents said they had a monetization strategy in place. But let's see what people have to say. A number of options open to you. Are you just starting and looking for tools, expertise, and use cases? Do you have a basic set of capabilities in place? Are you developing capabilities with just a few use cases implemented? Have you a well-developed system in place with appropriate governance and multiple use cases implemented, or are you pretty advanced down this line? You've got a mature data monetization strategy in place. Please vote. We'll revisit the results in a second. While you are voting, I'm going to kick off the first question. It will go to Samantha. As you travel, Samantha, and talk to clients and potential clients, what do you think has been the trigger for organizations to start considering monetizing the data they produce? After all, they have been producing this data for quite some time. So what's the trigger now?
Yeah, so the world obviously has just become a lot more digitized. Businesses are coming online. And so that also means that there is just more valuable data being created and collected. To support this growth, innovative technology has been developed and continues to develop at a very quick pace, which improves data collection, aggregation, and storage and distribution of that data. So this all supports sort of the supply side of the equation. On the demand side, however, you're also seeing a huge increase in demand. So, why are businesses looking for data? They're wanting to perform competitor analysis to seek how they can gain an advantage. They're using data as a way to better evaluate business decisions and mitigate risk, understand consumer behavior and intent, particularly post-pandemic. And for our clients, mostly in the capital markets, they've been using data for a long time, but to understand sort of the companies that are winning and losing and help them facilitate their trades. But with all this new data coming online, they're really just looking for an information advantage over their competitors. So what does this result in? New revenue streams and increasing your return on investment for your data assets for the supply side. And for the demand side, it results in, increased profit, alpha, and growth, really.
Very good. Thank you very much. Rezo, from your standpoint, as someone who watches the sort of early stage companies, we've seen the explosion in alternative data sets and so on and so forth. What do you see as being a trigger here?
There is really I think no change in historical terms, right? Like if we look back to pretty much any point in time and from Middle Ages onwards, like there was always a conundrum where available data outstripped what is possible to transmit and use and process. And you could look back from like mailmen delivering parcels to the first dial-in internet, to relational databases being replaced or complemented by next gen data infrastructure. It's still the same question, right? Like ultimately we can record and sense and process and gather more data than we can use. So really there is a arms race here, right? Like it's a bit of like a Cold War that like our ambition grows and grows and grows, and like the technology is playing catch up, and that's what we continue to see, right? Like that this is fascinating. The complexity is increasing, and that's great news for smart people who know how to use technology or know how to build it, because their skill set is going to increase in value. It's great for data owners because their value is increasing in value to the end user, because the transmission mechanism is getting better, and ultimately it's a win-win all over, which benefits the investor at the end. So very glad for taking a small part in that journey. But that's what we are seeing, right? Like that these smart early stage teams are getting more resources to build truly global offerings, which is fantastic.
Excellent, thank you. Well, let's take a look at what our audience said about our poll. So if I can invite panelists to have a quick look, the winner here is that we're just starting and looking for tools. That seems to be where most people are at, but some people are dabbling. So let's see if the panel have any response to that. Do these results surprise you? Who would like to stab?
Yeah, sure. From my side, no, it doesn't surprise me at all. I think one of the things that we're seeing right now is organizations are realizing that they have to become masters of their own data before they can start actually taking that data to market. And so many organizations have started playing around with new tools that allow them to start interacting with that data in new ways. You see the growth of Snowflake, the growth of Databricks inside of the marketplace as a way to start processing this data and packaging it for sale, because that's the first step. I think too, there's many different ways to take your data to market that people are evaluating, looking at both going through the traditional marketplaces and listing it alongside every other organization out there, starting their own marketplaces or going to bespoke marketplaces. So it makes a lot of sense that people are in a stage where they're testing out different approaches that they can take and different tools that will help them get there.
Very good. Anyone else?
Yeah. No, I agree with all of that. I think there's the sources of data, and I've just put the dealer hat on as I represent the Canadian banks and dealers primarily at the moment, but this is not what they do for a living. And so, they generate massive amounts of data, and they also need massive amounts of data to make decisions, manage risk, and so forth. They're just not in that business. So, if there's a staging type setup or a marketplace or third parties that can help on an agnostic basis to lift their data to get better governance, better structures, better quality, scope of coverage, and align interests, I think that's kind of where the heft needs to be focused. And I do think that working with peers is an important part of all of this, to commercialize.
Very good. Well, that segues quite nicely to my my next question, which so I'll stick with you, Andre, if I may. You mentioned the brokers, and not being perhaps their core business, but I mean, what kinds of organisations are finding that they have valuable data that others may want to buy or consume?
Yeah, I think as I mentioned, we are working with the dealers. I've had conversations with other jurisdictions as well, like Australia and the UK. Dealers do have a ton of data that they generate, that they use. I think of bonds, terms and conditions, the reference data. A lot of this data, pricing, trades. This data sort of flows out, and I call it leakage. And there's no sort of governance to it, and no IP associated with it directly, and they get to buy their data back, right? So I think this opaque data, it's very fragmented, and they need some discipline, they need help to bring it up to a better level. And I think again that can help monetize a variety of data sets. And I also think, when you look at the financial crisis and some of the issues around LIBOR, this data is required for benchmarking and effectively underpins efficient capital markets and to reduce risk. So it's incumbent on all the stakeholders to, put some effort into this data, not only for supporting capital markets, but also to commercialize.
Very good. Nicholas, this is not just confined to financial firms, is it? I mean, there's other types of firms that have data that can be commercialized and then be of interest to financial firms and others.
Definitely. I mean, I think if we look at the alternative data space and how much it's exploded over the past couple of years, we can see that organizations in all industries are starting to realize that the data that they have is valuable to other people. You know, over the past 10 years, we've gone through this experience where organizations are realizing that data is valuable to them. And now they're starting to realize that that data is also going to be valuable to others. And so that's created an effect where people are looking at the data they're using internally, trying to understand how that use case is relevant to the different types of insights they're looking for, and seeing if there's a way that they can anonymously be distributing that outwards and creating a new revenue stream for their different data markets.
Very good. So what in your experience what characteristics make data sets valuable in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is, you know, the data has to be good. We've all seen the studies that have been saying that some of the most amount of work that data scientists are spending is in cleaning data in order to prepare it. So something that really takes a data set into the high value state is when it's very easy to use and it's very clean. So the downstream users that actually purchase that data can start implementing it into their platforms. Another thing we've seen that's really important is the ease of evaluation. How simple is it for the organization that wants to buy that data to realize that that data is applicable to the questions that they're looking to answer? And so when organizations provide tools that allow the data buyer to explore the data before they purchase it, or to quickly start to play around with it with the data that they have, this can definitely break down the barriers to a successful data sale.
So there's sort of like sandbox approach, letting data scientists play with it before they start applying the data to their models and that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Very good. Samantha, from your experience, characteristics that make data sets valuable, what do you see?
Yeah, so we look at for certain attributes that are available to our predominant client base, as I mentioned, in capital markets. So, you know, although that's quite specific, I think it's very much the same for and relevant to any other consumer of data, but potentially they bear different weighting depending on the use case. So a couple of things is history. Our hedge fund clients prefer at least a minimum of 3 years. Some actually prefer a minimum of 5 years history. That's purely for backtesting purposes. You know, coverage, which is something that's fairly unique to capital markets as well. So the stock IDs, is it relevant to the regions where they're exposed and the sectors? Frequency, so how often it can be delivered. Our clients prefer daily, if not weekly. Sometimes, you know, if you can only access the data on a monthly, quarterly, annual basis, it's not as valuable, obviously. Completeness, as Nicholas mentioned, is very important. Accuracy, but another sort of different attribute for our clients is uniqueness. So we're talking about sort of the alternative data space. The data ultimately needs to have an investment use case. So being able to present that and articulate that, as Nicholas said, definitely helps with a successful sale. But the use case needs to be able to predict and analyze company performance to determine the winners and losers, and, you know, preferably telling them something they didn't already know. And I think that's the thing really, and more broadly, is that I believe any data could be valuable should it be able to answer a question to somebody that they haven't been able to answer before. But I think the question does remain as to how much would you actually pay for that data?
Absolutely. Very interesting. Let's get into the question of what data producers need to take into account as they consider monetizing their data. And I'd like to stay with you, if I may, Samantha, on that one. So what do they need to think about, worry about, or take into account?
Yeah, there's definitely an amount of consideration to be had before you approach data monetization. It does depend on the size of the organization and the level of data maturity, as we say. It needs to be really approached as though you are creating a completely new function to the business, which requires its own processes, procedures, but which also align, you know, with the function needs to align with sort of other business objectives as well. I like to give the example of, you know, HR. It's generally a function of the business that is created later on. Just say you've got a business of 20 people, you've just raised Series A, you've got huge growth projections, and you're going to be acquiring a lot more staff in the future. Before you go out and do that, you can no longer rely on the office manager and the CEO and maybe some other person in the business. You really have to create new processes, procedures, potentially deploy new technology infrastructure that can support, the analysis, evaluation of candidates, how to find the candidates. But I think the most, I suppose, comparable thing to, creating a data function for your business is the fact that it can have a potentially huge, big impact and cost to the business if you get it wrong. If you're hiring the wrong people, investing time in the wrong places, it can be costly to the business, and the same goes for creating a data function. But more specifically, certain things that we take our clients through is a strategic data evaluation. Identifying the core and exhaust data that is being created, developing data dictionaries for that data, starting to think about how you could also productize that data based on, legal, technical, ethical, and commercial considerations, develop use cases. Who's your target market, who's actually going to find your data valuable, and then developing a go-to-market strategy. So considering, whether it's worth setting up your own sales team or whether you're going to be engaging, third-party partners such as ourselves to assist with distribution, and also considering, the tech and infrastructure is a big thing that will obviously improve the overall process from data collection through to distribution.
Very good, thank you. Andre, as someone perhaps on the producer side, does that resonate with you? Are those some of the boxes that you checked when you looked at this kind of approach?
Yeah, I'd say everything that Sammy said is exactly on point. I mean, even, when we talk about the characteristics of data, if you look at the uniqueness of every jurisdiction, and I call it market conventions, every market has its unique conventions, and some of the global vendors find it challenging to address those. So I think from a source level, you need to consider, where do you play in this market? In Canada, we have Quebec muni bonds, we have, mortgage-backed securities that are pretty opaque, and so, also the use cases, Sammy mentioned, for us, it was FRTB that kind of kicked off the data pooling. So I'd say, if you're looking at where to focus, what are the big things you can kind of knock off without boiling the ocean, and start there with a market data management or governance approach. So things like, risk factors and how do you, apply attributes. The other important thing too is, establishing your intellectual property framework for data assets. I come from the exchange world, and I ran trading and data and some infrastructure stuff there. But data licensing was one of those things we took pretty seriously. And as an individual source, it's pretty hard to establish that. But I think as a group, or if you work with a party that can help you, and then combine assets, whether it's through a marketplace or through somebody that deals with alternative data, that can help put it all together for you. I think those are great sort of upstream entities that can help you. And again, critical mass is important, pooling consortiums, and leveraging that collective package, I would say. And again, look for standards, right? So, if it's FRTB, if it's, FPML, whatever, fix, and so forth, just in ensuring the scope and quality is interoperable and ready for prime time. And then lastly, I think for bonus points, if you're looking to, monetize data, what are you doing to embed contextual metadata that can drive richer classifications and analytics and things like that? So, I think the more we think about that upstream, at a future date, you'll be able to leverage those or monetize those additional attributes that you've put in place.
Very good, thank you very much. Nicholas, maybe I'll ask you for final thoughts on that, things that people need to take into account when considering doing this.
Yeah, definitely. I think something that we see often when people are considering taking their data to market is they're only thinking about the data itself and what the data needs to have. But there's also a whole process of data sales that needs to be considered. And we usually break that into 3 different parts where we call it discoverability. How do you make that data discoverable, understandable, accessible, et cetera, which I think Andre and Sammy kind of touched on during their parts. The next is that purchasability stage. How easy is it for the organization to actually go through the purchasing and licensing process that you've set up to make it a low friction process in order to actually get that data? And then the distribution phase, which is how does that data actually get out to the customer? And the users for each of these 3 different phases are very different, where the data scientists might be doing the discovery phase, trying to understand how that data is relevant. Your procurement teams are doing the purchasing stage and going through all the licensing. And then the data engineers are responsible for getting that data into the system. So there's many different handoffs that need to be considered, and figuring out how you can accelerate organizations through those different handoffs to make that data sale actually successful is really important.
Very good. Thank you very much. Seen some questions come in on Slido, which is absolutely fantastic. This one is probably pertinent to be addressed at this point in our line of questioning. Maybe I'll throw this one back at you, Nicholas, first. How can monetizing data sets work on a practical basis when we are using them internally and making changes to them for our own purposes and selling them externally? So I guess, how can we create products from data that we're still working on, in short?
Definitely. I think it's really in that word, productizing that data. So something that we see is data goes through many different stages on its way to generating an analysis or an insight. And each of those different stages produces a form of the data that could potentially be monetized or could be valuable to others. And what we generally coach organizations on is identifying which of those stages are going to best speak to the customers you're looking at. Sammy also talked on the productization of data, which is a key tenet of our platform, where you take the data that you have and identify what turns this from just data that's existing into a product that is usable and accessible. There's lots of tools out there that help with that from a technology perspective, but really at the end of the day, it's an analysis perspective of, is this specific form of this data going to be valuable to others or not?
Very good. Samantha, do you have anything to add to that? That sort of a juggling match?
No, Nicholas answered it very well. I'll just say that, if you are able to productize the data in order to be able to start monetizing that straight away, and that doesn't change, because it is very, very important that once you start distributing externally, that the data does not change. And often, you've got sort of legal and commercial, requirements around that.
So it's about getting sort of compliance and governance and checks around that before.
Correct. Exactly. Yeah.
Very good. Okay. Nicholas sort of touched on this point a minute ago, but I'll throw it over to Rezo about emerging technologies and tools. What's out there, Rezo? What's helping people who want to go to market with their data sets? What are they using?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and I think it's fundamentally relevant to large institutions and smaller institutions wanting to service large institutions or large buyers, right? And that is, the technology in itself is going through a transformation where competence is both increasing, or required competence is both increasing and decreasing at the same time. So what I mean by that, we are moving from a world where you had to assemble and build yourself a car anytime you wanted to drive something, and you had to find the petrol, refine it for yourself, fill the car up, and so every single thing was like in your hand. And what I'm talking about is the build versus buy decision, right? Like you had to build it yourself. And every piece you had to control and own, because you couldn't rely on anything else to be good enough for the exact high performance use case if it was a business critical decision. And that has led down, a lot of industries, but including financial services, to be a very heavy build build technology stack. And the world has moved to open source, large building blocks, and the most performant piece of kits are pre-built, and you have to only pull it together yourself. So what emerging technologies are really doing is making it easier to buy less and less and less of the technology and use it more and more and more. So I think what is amazing is, we started with Amazon and AWS and things like that, where an SME or a non-technology company doesn't have to have servers and maintain them. Now we are getting to where you don't have to build your data web store. You can just buy it and have someone else manage that service for you. You don't have to know how to ingest difficult data or deal with complex APIs or deal with very demanding clients on the data quality front. You can buy that off the shelf. So I think there is a huge democratization that, frankly, technology is enabling. It doesn't mean you don't need data expertise. It doesn't mean you don't need to know the audience you're selling to, but it does mean that technology is becoming less of a hurdle for anyone to do this. And so I would expect we are still in the early days, and we're going to see in our lifetime this becoming one of the key value drivers of how institutions reset themselves to being a data consumer or a data producer and monetize their data better internally and externally. So I think that's the emerging technology view. There is a lot there, right? From databases and performance there, enough to look at graph databases and what they deliver on anti-money laundering, for example. You can look at low-code, no-code platforms where you set up a data infrastructure with a few clicks. It's amazing, it's mind-blowing. It's very early days, right? You can't do a lot with those, but you can actually get there almost 80% of the way. I think that's what's changing, and that's hugely exciting for anyone in the data value chain, because I think that means that there is a lot of value that was previously left on the table is now getting unlocked.
Very good. On that then, Nicholas, emerging technologies, perhaps we can talk a little bit about this data marketplace concept. Seems a logical step on this build towards buy progression that Rezo has sort of described. What is a data marketplace, and how does that work?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, a data marketplace is really not too complex of a concept. It's a place where data vendors can come to list their data for sale. Where we've seen a lot of the industry starting out is a sort of generic data marketplace, thinking Amazon, but for data, where all data vendors of any type, any format, any vertical are going to be listing their data for purchase. What we've seen is this sort of creates an ocean of data that's very hard to sift through as a data consumer when going to look for data that's actually valuable to them. And so the industry has started to shift a bit, where we're now seeing a lot of specialized marketplaces that, rather than doing the full gambit of data and verticals, is going to focus in one. If you look at Quandl inside of the alternative data space, they've created a single location for alternative data sets to be listed. You're seeing new marketplaces like S&P and CME's marketplace that we power, where they're going to be listing data that's relevant to the securities that are traded on their exchanges or the insights that they're generating. And we're even starting to see now organizations creating their own marketplaces that is just their primary data sets or very direct third-party data sets. FactSet has started listing all of their data sets in each marketplace, but also building out their own data marketplace. And so we're sort of seeing three different tiers: a full kind of marketplace where everybody posts, a specialized marketplace that's focused on a specific vertical or use case, and then vendor-specific marketplaces that are going to be specific to the data producer and data vendor.
Very interesting. And are you seeing sort of financial data sort of producers create data marketplaces for their own internal users? Would a bank or a brokerage look at using this kind of approach to service its own consumers?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, private marketplaces is something that we're very accustomed with. We have organizations that are using our technology to service their own internal groups and creating sort of a security flow, a governance flow. I think Andre can pitch in on this one too, because the banks, interacting with one another in this private ecosystem and transferring and pooling data together is creating this community effect and network effect that they're generating insights in. So it's not just public marketplaces. Absolutely, the private marketplace is a key piece too.
Feel free.
Yeah, if you wanted me to add on there, Nicholas. So we worked together early days to get this thing off the ground, and certainly do-it-yourself model was part of it, right? So data pooling to solve an FRTB problem was the nascent idea. And then, having each dealer only be able to access the full details of their information, whether it's time series, categorized, by certain classifications, risk factors, sector, you name it. And so I think the do-it-yourself model actually has been taken up by the dealers quite effectively for a number of use cases. And you could call it a data mart, I guess. And then, more holistically, it's now servicing our business as underpinning our commercial efforts for, curation and manufacturing of value-added data.
Very good, thank you, Samantha. Maybe we can get some context from you in terms of, how the data marketplace works as far as you're concerned and working with your clients on this approach.
Yeah, so TIXSmith, as you mentioned, they service the data vendor, but there are also other public marketplaces, as he mentioned. Nicholas mentioned Quandl. You've got so many coming to market. AWS has got their own marketplace. Google has got their own marketplace now. You've got DataRaid, which is sort of servicing more the corporate market. There are just more and more sort of coming online, and I think. It's a great way to sort of connect the supply and demand for data. As a data vendor, if you're wanting to create your own personal data, I think you also then need to think about actual distribution. So yes, you have a web storefront, and you can easily sort of distribute and take payment for all of your data or a subset of your data. So you can obviously easily productize that for the buyer, but how do you actually draw traffic to your sort of web store? And I think that's where we sort of come into place, because we look at sort of, I suppose, proactive distribution. So that's sort of just one consideration if you're going to go down sort of that route. But then the sort of more public marketplaces, what they do is they provide a wide range of data sources and types of data, specifically in the alternative data space. And in their own way, they sort of categorize and help reduce the effort for buyers to find the data that they need. One of the sort of challenges that are faced is the fact that the categorization, there is sort of no industry standard. How do you sort of categorize the alternative data? So I think then it becomes a little bit more difficult, but you can also, as a buyer, post an ad, for example, such as Gumtree. If you're looking for a sofa, you can post it out of what you want and people effectively come to you. So that's sort of how they work. But I think how it's sort of beneficial to the financial market space is that it gives firms the ability to explore what sort of data is out there and start thinking about how to leverage that, because they're not subscription based. There's no upfront cost. They take a commission or rev share with the data vendor, so there's no sort of cost to the buyer. And I think it will be a good way to sort of promote mainstream adoption of data.
Very good. So we've sort of moved on to the consumer side here. The people actually will be consuming the data. Andre, maybe I can come back to you and we can discuss a bit some of the benefits of the data marketplace approach to consumers of the data. What's in it for the people who actually got to sort of buy this stuff off the marketplace?
Yeah, so I think accessibility, as I mentioned earlier, sort of kicking this off from a coffee shop. I called up TickSmith and I said, can you help a brother out? We need to stand this up and give comfort to not only the sources but downstream that we have the ability to provide infosec, tracking, reporting, entitlements, and so forth. So having that kind of framework makes it easier to deliver data. From a consumer perspective, it was an agnostic choice. So I looked at various vendor options, working with them, and so forth. A lot of vendors obviously do a great job at aggregating data, packaging up, and licensing it back to the users. And so they, potentially have a lot to lose, but they also have a lot to gain, right? So, again, when you look at the OTC data, really fragmented, opaque, and so forth. So how do you align the sources to give them some upside, incentives, rev shares, establishing their IP along the supply chain? Then you elevate the quality of data, the scope of coverage, classifications. And then, from a consumability perspective, again, folks like TickSmith, they have APIs, you can deliver files, you can export, you can query, and it just makes it a lot easier to sort of, hoover in the data into your own workflows and infrastructure, rather than giving them a point solution or, a hardened kind of, one size fits all situation. So I think, the flexibility and interoperability for, the ecosystem is important.
Very good. Nicholas, from your perspective, bit of insight in terms of where you see benefits for the consumers?
Yeah, definitely. I think, one of the best places to look is the traditional data sales route that existed in capital markets, of going to Bloomberg or Refinitiv and having hundreds of phone calls before data actually gets into your systems. The data marketplace is streamlining that data sales and data distribution process. It's making it so that the self-service that's available in the physical world with Amazon and online e-commerce shopping, bringing that into the virtual world and making it so that data purchasing can be as easy as that. We're seeing it where organizations are now buying more and more data because more and more data is accessible. So the proliferation of data marketplaces is creating a community effect and a network effect where institutions that have questions are going out and searching for data that's going to be relevant to them. And so it's a very exciting time. I think Rezo mentioned it's very nascent at this point in time, but we're seeing so much traction already starting, and many of the big players have started opening up different marketplaces, like Sammy had mentioned, including some of the big tech giants as well. You look at Snowflake opening up their data marketplace because they're also seeing this value add. I think one of the other things that we've seen with the data marketplaces that we've powered is, for consumers, it serves as an entry point to the organization. It's often that, they will go to an organization, they'll buy some historical data, test it out, see that it's valuable, and then they'll start buying more data and even starting to sign up for different services that the organization offers on top of that data. So it's serving as a lead gen for not just data sales, but also entire service lines inside of different organizations, creating, again, that network effect where people are relying on one another to increase their business across the board.
Okay.
One sort of, just if you don't mind, thing that came to mind too was the barrier to entry for innovation, right? So a lot of smaller vendors come to us and say, listen, we can't pay for swaths of data to test out our technologies or models and so forth. I think it's a great way to sort of get some proof of concepts off the ground to encourage innovation hubs and so forth. So, we've seen a lot of that actually in our dealings as well. And I certainly still appreciate the global vendors in terms of channels and the reach, and from a commercialization perspective, I'll still give them props for a lot of what they do. But I also think that there's as I said, a staging point that can be helpful for the entire industry, and other folks that can be crafty around that.
Certainly, we did a research project during the lockdown last year where we talked to a lot of data scientists, and one of the obstacles for doing more experimentation was that lead time, cost, messing about in order to get, there's an opportunity in the marketplace. If we just get some data in, we can test this, see if it works. 3 months later, the opportunity, someone else is there or what have you. It's agility and flexibility, low cost, starts to help people. I think that there's a great question here from Slido, which I think really sort of relates to that. So I'll throw that out to the panel before we start to wind things down, because we're amazingly getting out of time. The question reads: do you see these marketplaces requiring some of the legacy distribution models, or should they be pushing the frontier of distribution with new technologies that are coming out? So I guess in other words, sort of gets to this point of, the marketplace has consumed data in a certain way for quite some time. Is the next step to sort of push that frontier of distribution? Who would like to have a go at that?
Yeah, I can maybe take a first stab. What I would say is the answer is both. I think what we're seeing is organizations want to still access data in the ways that they're used to. They've invested inside of systems that can interact with that. It's a traditional way that they are used to, they understand, and they have technology and expertise inside their organization to do so. The problem with the legacy distribution models is that for big amounts of data, they're not necessarily going to be the most effective. There's huge data engineering pipelines that need to be created or maintained in order to consistently download and access that data. And the new technologies like data sharing that Snowflake has announced, and Delta sharing that Databricks has announced, is a way in which this huge amount of data can become instantly accessible without those data engineering pipelines. And so depending on the consumer, you want to meet them where their technology is. There are some firms in financial services that are very future forward looking. They're going to be up with the times with the new processing and distribution models. And there are going to be some that are still leveraging a lot of the legacy systems for a variety of different reasons. And it's on the responsibility of the data vendor to support both of those. To enable all of their customers to use their data in the way that makes the most sense to the customer if they want to be successful in their data sales activities.
Thank you. Anyone else on that new distribution models? Okay, let's move on because we are running out of time. Bit of an open-ended question. Let's see what the panel thinks is coming next. Samantha, I'll start with you. What's next for this segment, do you think?
Yeah, I think everyone would agree that it will continually be a focus on data monetization. It will rapidly grow. Innovation will still very much continue in this space. I think in the coming years, you'll then see some sort of consolidation of the players within the space, and hopefully it makes that the consolidation makes it easier for businesses, wanting to solve some of their data challenges to find a solution, because at the moment the market is quite fragmented across the value chain. But I think what we've sort of overcome the problem of previously not having enough data versus now there's just too much data, almost too much data too. And so I think the next thing, is to be able to, identify the data that's most valuable to you, quickly, efficiently, to answer a specific question that you have. And a part of that is, being able to find the right tools to help you sort of analyze it and then leverage that data as well.
Very good. Andre, where next?
Yeah, what Sammy said. And also, from my perspective, I see more pooling consortiums. Again, I've had conversations with various jurisdictions, and there, you can see that even, the SocGen announcement recently around reference data, but certainly around transaction data and other pricing and so forth. I think you're going to see a bunch of, regional pools, and certainly we have a framework and a model that can attest to the success of that. More IP rigor around data assets at the source. I think it's important to establish those, not only for monetization, but licensing and, also liability, to be honest with you, right? So That's an important issue I don't think a lot of folks think about when their data is out there floating around the ether. And lastly, I'd suggest that utilizing some agnostic data management entities as an agent to aggregate and license data can help at the head end of our journey.
Very good, thank you. It just actually, you just brought up an interesting point, which I think draws me back to a question that I missed in the Slido. The question reads, what data sets would the panel say are most valuable? Well, if we knew that, we wouldn't be on this panel, we'd be selling the data sets. But I think the most important part of this question is, what would the terms and conditions, what would those look like for these data sets? Could the panel consider that?
Yeah, I mean, quickly, I can say that, for us, aggregating trade data, holistic trade data, which is a pretty unique, at the transaction level, a pretty unique arrangement with pooling data, and using that to create pricing services and ensure the fidelity of the market price reflects where the market is and who the players are and so forth. So I think, there's lots to be made in commercializing pricing data to be used for benchmarks and risk purposes and so forth.
Very good. Nicholas, anything to add on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think when it comes to licensing, it's tough to say that a standard is going to exist because there's so many different types of data. I think a lot of it's going to mimic actually the standards that have been in place for a long time and just be updated to modern day. Everybody knows that more current data is more valuable than historical data, unless you're talking huge amounts of historical data. And so, the industry has already defined some standards around the way in which you're licensing out this real-time data, this data that's immediately accessible. And we just need to make sure that all of the different data sets that are going into market now have the matching compliance and regulations around that for that.
Very good. Okay. Well, we are actually out of time now. So I'm going to wrap things up here. First of all, by thanking all of our panelists for sharing their insights with us. Thanks to Rezo, to Nicholas, to Andre, and to Samantha. Thanks, everyone. Fascinating.
Pleasure.
That session went very fast for me. It's a fast-moving area, I think I can say, and certainly something we'll keep an eye on. I would remind the audience that you should now go and download that white paper that we've put up on the platform. And I would also mention that a team did a pretty comprehensive review of the sort of financial data marketplace segment on our trading tech insight channel and on the data management insight channel. So go check that out. It'll give you some good perspective on who's out there in this space. So please do take a look at that. So again, thanks to our panelists. This does bring us to the close of today's sessions. So let me offer a warm thanks to all of our presenters and panelists, and of course to our sponsors, in particular our platinum sponsors. Those are OneTrust, DXC Luxoft, and Solidatus. Our gold sponsors are ActiveNav, Alveo, Bureau van Dijk, Big ID, and QSIP Global Services, Derivative Service Bureau, Datactics, Kingland, TickSmith, and Smartstream. Thanks to all of our sponsors, without whose support events like this are not possible. We are back tomorrow at 9 o'clock Eastern Time. If you have missed any of the sessions from today, they are available on demand for a limited time, so you can check those out. And with that, I'll bid you farewell. See you tomorrow. Goodbye.